Stop scrolling. You think you know the Peaky Blinders? Forget everything the show told you. What if I told you the iconic flat caps hid a truth far more terrifying than anything on screen? The real gangs of 1920s Birmingham were far more brutal. Their world a savage dance of razor blades, blood, and unforgiving streets where survival meant embracing violence that makes fiction pale in comparison. This isn't about fictional drama or gentleman gangsters. This is about the horrific truth behind Birmingham's most feared gangs of the 1920s. Were they truly the romanticized anti-heroes of television, or something far more sinister? Prepare to have your perceptions shattered as we unearth the authentic, gritty history of the men and women who truly ruled the streets with razor blades sewn into their caps and blood on their hands. Before you watch another episode, you need to know the real, uncompromising violence and power struggles that shaped Birmingham's underworld. Witness the untold stories that inspired the legend, where honor was bought with brutality and respect was carved with steel. Welcome back to the Bedside Historian, where the shadows of the past reveal their darkest secrets to those brave enough to listen. I'm your host, and tonight we journey to the smoke-choked streets of Birmingham, where the real Peaky Blinders carved their legend not with noble intentions or family loyalty, but with razor blades and an appetite for violence that would make demons weep. This is not the romanticized tale you know from television, but the blood-soaked truth of men who built empires on the broken bones of their enemies. So settle in, dim the lights, and prepare for a story that will strip away every comfortable lie you've been told about Birmingham's most notorious gangsters. Chapter 1. The Smoke-Choked Streets of Small Heath. The year 1919 brought no peace to the cobblestone arteries of Small Heath, where the Great War's end had merely traded foreign trenches for domestic battlefields. Thomas Gilbert walked these streets with the measured pace of a predator surveying his territory, his flat cap pulled low over eyes that had seen too much death to flinch at the sight of blood. The razor blades sewn into his cap's peak caught the weak autumn light filtering through Birmingham's perpetual haze of industrial smoke, gleaming like promises of pain for any man foolish enough to challenge his authority. Birmingham in 1919 was a city that breathed through factory chimneys, its lungs filled with the soot and ash of the Industrial Revolution's relentless appetite. The smoke rose from foundries and metalworks in columns so thick they blotted out the sun for hours at a time, casting the crowded neighbourhoods of Small Heath, Bawdsley and Aston in perpetual twilight. In this grey world where the air tasted of iron and desperation, families of 8 or 10 squeezed into terraced houses barely wide enough for 2 rooms, their walls so thin that a man's dying screams could wake entire streets. Thomas Gilbert was 24 years old and had already killed 3 men, though he spoke of it to no one except in the confessional whispers he shared with his razor blade before each job. He had returned from France with shrapnel in his left leg and a hole in his soul where mercy used to live, finding Birmingham streets no kinder than the Western Front's muddy hell. The difference was that here, the enemy wore familiar faces and spoke with Birmingham accents, but they bled just the same when steel found flesh. The back-to-back houses of Small Heath rose from the earth like broken teeth, their brick facades blackened by decades of industrial smoke, until they seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Between these narrow dwellings ran alleyways so cramped that 2 men could not pass without one stepping aside, creating perfect hunting grounds for those who understood that violence was often a matter of choosing the right terrain. Gilbert knew every inch of these passages, every loose brick that could trip a fleeing man, every doorway that offered concealment for an ambush. On this particular morning, Gilbert stood outside the Garrison Tavern, watching dock workers shuffle past on their way to 12-hour shifts that would pay them barely enough to keep their families fed. Their faces bore the grey pallor of men who had traded their health for wages, their backs bent from lifting loads that would cripple horses. These were not Gilbert's enemies, but they were not his allies either. They were simply the landscape through which he moved, obstacles to be navigated rather than threats to be eliminated. The pub itself squatted on the corner of Garrison Lane like a wounded animal, its windows so grimy that lamplight could barely penetrate the accumulated grime of decades. Inside, men who had returned from the war with pieces of their souls missing gathered to drink away memories that refused to stay buried. They spoke in whispers of battles fought in mud and blood, of friends left behind in foreign soil, of the hollow feeling that came with surviving when better men had died. For many, The transition from killing Germans to killing rival gang members required no great leap of imagination. Violence was violence, and death was death, regardless of the uniform worn by the corpse. Gilbert pushed through the tavern's doors into air thick with tobacco smoke and the stench of unwashed bodies. The interior was lit by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on walls, stained brown by years of pipe smoke and spilled beer. Men clustered around small tables, their conversations conducted in the low tones of conspirators, while the barman served drinks with the watchful eyes of a man who had learned that trouble could erupt without warning in establishments that catered to Birmingham's criminal class. "Tommy," called out Mickey Donnelly from his usual corner table, his scarred face splitting into a grin that revealed teeth filed to points, a modification he had made himself using a prison blacksmith's file during his last stretch in Winsome Green. "Got word from the Saltley boys. They're moving product through our territory again." Gilbert nodded slowly, his fingers unconsciously touching the razor blades hidden in his cap. Territory was everything in Birmingham's underworld, not just streets and buildings, but the invisible boundaries that determined who lived and who died, who prospered and who starved. The Saltley gang's incursion was not just business competition but a direct challenge to Gilbert's authority, one that would require a response measured in blood and broken bones. The economics of gang warfare were simple and brutal. Protection money from illegal bookmakers, tribute from pub landlords, percentages from stolen goods. All of it depended on the certainty that crossing the gang meant consequences worse than compliance. Fear was the currency that bought cooperation, and fear had to be regularly refreshed through public displays of savagery that reminded potential rivals why challenging established order was tantamount to suicide. Gilbert's crew consisted of 8 men who had learned their trade in the trenches of France and the back alleys of Birmingham with equal facility. There was Danny Sullivan, whose speciality was using a weighted sock filled with ball bearings to crush skulls without leaving obvious evidence of murder. Billy McCann preferred the more artistic approach of razor work, creating facial scars that marked his victims as examples for life. Harry Fowler had hands like hammers and a reputation for beating men to death with nothing but his fists, while Jimmy Fletcher could throw a knife with accuracy that would have impressed a circus performer. These were not the romantic anti-heroes of popular imagination, but products of a system that offered working-class men few alternatives to violence as a means of advancement. They had grown up in neighborhoods where children learned to fight before they learned to read, where showing weakness invited predation, where the strong survived by preying on the weak in an endless cycle of brutality that Birmingham's authorities seemed powerless to interrupt. The afternoon brought news that would require Gilbert's personal attention. A message arrived via one of the street children who served as the gang's communication network, boys and girls as young as 8 who could move through Birmingham's crowded streets without attracting notice, carrying information between criminal enterprises with the efficiency of a military courier service. The message was simple. The Saltley gang had beaten one of Gilbert's bookmakers nearly to death and stolen a week's worth of betting receipts. Gilbert's response was equally direct. He selected 3 of his most reliable men and set out for the Rose and Crown pub in Saltley, where intelligence indicated the rival gang's leaders would be celebrating their successful raid. The walk through Birmingham's interconnected neighbourhoods took them past scenes of urban decay that would have shocked visitors from London's more prosperous districts. Children playing in streets that served as open sewers, women hanging laundry between buildings so close together that clotheslines could span the gap, men standing idle outside factory gates that no longer offered employment to Birmingham's surplus population. The Rose and Crown occupied the ground floor of a building that had seen better decades, its exterior brickwork crumbling from the constant assault of Birmingham's polluted air. Through grimy windows, Gilbert could see the men he had come to kill, their faces flushed with drink and success as they divided the stolen money among their crew. They had made the mistake of assuming that Gilbert's reputation was built on fear rather than genuine capability, a miscalculation that would prove fatal. Gilbert entered the pub alone, his cap pulled low and his hands empty of visible weapons. The razor blades in his cap were sharp enough to slice through a man's carotid artery with minimal pressure, while the knife concealed in his boot could penetrate a ribcage with surgical precision. He approached the table where the Saltley Gang's leaders sat counting their stolen profits, their attention focused on money rather than the death that had just walked through their door. "Evening, lads," Gilbert said quietly, his voice carrying the calm tone of a man discussing the weather rather than planning multiple murders. "Heard you've been conducting business in my territory without proper authorization." The violence that followed was swift and decisive. Gilbert's first cut opened Tommy Hartwell's throat to the spine, sending arterial spray across the pub's grimy walls while the man was still reaching for his own weapon. The second man died with Gilbert's boot knife between his ribs, the blade angled upward to puncture his heart before he could cry out for help. The third managed to draw a razor of his own before Gilbert's cap caught him across the face, the embedded blades laying open his cheek from ear to jaw in a wound that would mark him for life, if he survived the blood loss. The entire confrontation lasted less than 30 seconds, leaving 2 men dead and 1 dying on the pub's sawdust-covered floor. Gilbert retrieved his knife, wiped it clean on the dying man's coat, and walked out into Birmingham's smoke-filled evening as calmly as he had entered. Behind him, the Rose and Crown's patrons sat in stunned silence, knowing that they had witnessed an execution that would be discussed in whispers throughout the city's criminal underworld. By the time Gilbert returned to the Garrison Tavern, word of the killings had already reached Smallheath through the network of informants, relatives, and criminal associates that connected Birmingham's gangs like arteries in a circulatory system. His reputation had been reinforced through public demonstration of his willingness to employ lethal violence in defense of territorial boundaries, ensuring that future challenges to his authority would be considered more carefully by potential rivals. This was the reality of Birmingham's gang warfare in 1919, not the romanticized battles between honorable criminals portrayed in popular entertainment, but savage conflicts between desperate men who had learned that survival required embracing brutality that exceeded the violence they had witnessed in foreign wars. The streets of Smallheath were paved with broken dreams and broken bones, ruled by men who had traded their humanity for power measured in blood and terror. Chapter 2. The Birth of the Blade. The summer of 1890 brought no relief from Birmingham's industrial heat to the cramped streets of Bawdsley Green, where 14-year-old Henry Lightfoot crouched in his family's single room, carefully stitching razor blades into the peak of his father's old flat cap. The metal caught the weak light filtering through windows so begrimed with soot that noon looked like twilight, each blade sharp enough to slice through a man's flesh with the gentlest pressure. Henry's fingers worked with the precision of a boy who had learned that survival in Birmingham's slums required mastering skills that no Sunday school had ever taught. The flat cap itself was a working man's necessity in Birmingham's industrial districts, where factory chimneys belched smoke and ash that could blind a man if he walked bareheaded through the streets. Made of rough wool and designed to protect against both weather and industrial debris, these caps had become the uniform of Birmingham's working class. Docker and factory worker, street sweeper and gang member alike wore variations of the same practical headgear, but Henry Lightfoot was preparing to transform his cap into something far more dangerous than mere protection against the elements. The razor blades he selected had been stolen from Hutchinson's barbershop on Coventry Road, acquired during a smash-and-grab raid that Henry had performed with 3 other boys from his street. Each blade was approximately 2 inches long and honed to surgical sharpness, designed to slice through human hair with effortless precision. When sewn into the peak of a flat cap with only the cutting edge exposed, these blades became invisible weapons that could inflict devastating wounds with a simple headbutt or swipe of the cap. Henry had learned the technique from Billy Morse, a 17-year-old who ruled their section of Bawdsley Green through a combination of native cunning and demonstrated willingness to employ extreme violence against anyone who challenged his authority. Billy had shown Henry and the other younger boys how to prepare their caps, how to position the blades for maximum cutting power, and most importantly, how to use their modified headgear to create facial wounds that would mark their victims for life. "It's not about killing," Billy had explained during one of his informal lessons conducted in the abandoned factory building where the local gang gathered to plan their crimes and divide their stolen goods. "Dead men can't pay tribute, and they can't spread the word about what happens to people who cross us. But a man with his face carved up from ear to mouth, he becomes a walking advertisement for why folks should cooperate with our business arrangements." The technique Billy taught was simple but devastatingly effective. When confronted with an opponent, The gang member would grab his cap by the sides and swing it in a horizontal arc, the razor blades slicing through flesh and muscle with enough force to reach bone. The resulting wound, if properly delivered, would extend from the victim's ear to the corner of his mouth, creating a permanent scar that would mark him as someone who had crossed Birmingham's razor gangs. The injury would heal, but the disfigurement would serve as a lifelong reminder to the victim and a warning to anyone who saw him. Henry's family occupied a single room in a back-to-back house that they shared with 3 other families, their living space consisting of approximately 12 feet by 10 feet that served as bedroom, kitchen and parlour for parents and 4 children. Privacy was a luxury that working-class Birmingham could not afford. Intimate conversations were conducted in whispers. Family disputes became neighbourhood entertainment, and personal business was impossible to keep private when walls were thin enough to hear a neighbour's heartbeat. His father worked 14-hour shifts at the local foundry when work was available, returning home with his lungs full of metal dust and his hands burned by molten iron. His mother took in washing from wealthier neighbourhoods, spending her days bent over a tub of scalding water that left her hands raw and red from lye soap and constant moisture. Neither parent had the time or energy to supervise their children's activities, leaving Henry and his siblings to educate themselves in the harsh curriculum of Birmingham's streets. The education Henry received was thorough and practical. By age 10, he could pick a pocket with fingers light enough to extract coins without the victim feeling their weight disappear. By 12, he had learned to fight with fists, feet, bottles, and improvised weapons, understanding that in Birmingham's slums, showing weakness invited predation from boys who had learned the same brutal lessons. By 14, he was ready to graduate to the razor blade, marking his transition from petty criminal to serious threat. The first time Henry used his modified cap in anger was during a territorial dispute with boys from the neighbouring district of Small Heath, who had made the mistake of attempting to collect protection money from shops that the Bordsley Green Gang considered their exclusive domain. The confrontation took place on a narrow bridge over one of Birmingham's industrial canals, where the 2 groups of teenage criminals faced each other with weapons that ranged from sharpened sticks to stolen kitchen knives. Henry's opponent was a boy named Tommy Crawford, approximately his own age but several inches taller and significantly heavier. Tommy carried a length of iron pipe that he swung with enough force to crush a skull, while Henry had only his modified cap and the speed that came from years of running from older, stronger enemies. The fight was brief but decisive. Henry feinted with his left hand, drawing Tommy's attention, then removed his cap and swung it in a horizontal arc that caught his opponent across the right side of his face. The razor blade sliced through Tommy's cheek with surgical precision, opening a wound that extended from his ear to the corner of his mouth and exposed the bone of his jaw. Blood sprayed across the bridge's stone surface as Tommy dropped his weapon and pressed both hands to his ruined face, screaming in pain and terror, while Henry calmly replaced his cap and walked away. The wound would heal, but the scar would mark Tommy Crawford for the remainder of his life as someone who had learned not to trespass on Bordsley Green territory. Word of Henry's victory spread through Birmingham's network of criminal youth with the speed that only violence could generate. Boys who had previously dismissed him as too small to be dangerous now treated him with the respectful wariness reserved for proven killers, while older gang members began to notice his potential as a recruit for more serious criminal enterprises. The razor blade had transformed Henry from victim to predator, giving him the reputation for violence that served as currency in Birmingham's underworld. The technique of sewing razor blades into flat caps spread throughout Birmingham's criminal districts like a contagious disease, adopted by gangs in Small Heath, Haston, Saltley, and every other neighbourhood where young men turned to crime as an alternative to industrial labour that killed slowly but inevitably. The modified caps became symbols of gang membership, distinguishing serious criminals from ordinary thugs, while providing weapons that were both concealed and readily available in any confrontation. By 1892, Birmingham's police had begun to recognise the pattern of facial wounds that characterised razor cap attacks, noting in their reports that victims consistently suffered similar injuries, horizontal cuts extending from ear to mouth, always on the right side of the face due to the natural swing pattern of right-handed attackers. The police response was typically ineffective, consisting mainly of increased patrols through known gang territories and stern warnings that accomplished nothing beyond driving criminal activity into less visible locations. The gangs themselves evolved rapidly in response to both police pressure and internal competition, developing hierarchies based on demonstrated violence and territorial control, rather than age or family connections. Leaders emerged not through inheritance or appointment, but through their ability to inspire fear in enemies and loyalty in followers, creating organizations that were both more effective and more dangerous than the loosely affiliated criminal groups that had preceded them. Henry Lightfoot's modification of his father's flat cap had introduced a weapon that would define Birmingham's gang culture for the next 3 decades, earning the razor gangs their name and their reputation for violence that exceeded anything previously seen in England's industrial cities. The Peaky Blinders were born not from noble intentions or family loyalty, but from the desperate creativity of working-class youth who had learned that survival required embracing brutality that civilized society preferred to ignore. The razor blade sewn into a flat cap became more than just a weapon. It was a symbol of defiance against a social system that offered working-class youth few alternatives to crime, a declaration that those who possessed nothing could still inspire fear in those who possessed everything. In Birmingham's smoke-choked streets, where children grew up breathing industrial poison and eating whatever they could steal, the razor blade represented power that could not be taken away by factory owners, police officers, or social reformers who understood nothing about the reality of life in England's industrial slums. Chapter 3. Thomas Mucklow's Kingdom. The Garrison Tavern in the spring of 1895 served as both public house and seat of power for Thomas Mucklow, who at 19 years old had carved out a criminal empire that extended across 3 streets of Smallheath through methods that would have impressed Machiavelli and horrified decent society. The pub squatted on the corner of Garrison Lane like a malevolent toad, its windows so thick with grime and tobacco smoke that the interior remained perpetually dim, even during the brightest summer afternoons. Within these smoke-filled walls, Mucklow held court with the absolute authority of a medieval lord, dispensing justice with razor and fist, while his subjects brought tribute extracted from Birmingham's illegal economy. Mucklow himself was unremarkable in appearance, average height, brown hair, and the pale complexion common to Birmingham's industrial districts, where sunlight struggled to penetrate the perpetual haze of factory smoke. What distinguished him from the thousands of other young men scratching out a living in Smallheath's warren of back-to-back houses was not physical prowess, but an absolute lack of mercy that had earned him a reputation for violence that extended far beyond his immediate territory. He possessed the rare combination of intelligence and savagery that marked natural leaders in Birmingham's criminal underworld, understanding that power derived not from being the strongest man in the room, but from being the one most willing to employ extreme violence against anyone who challenged his authority. The Garrison Tavern's back room served as Mucklow's office, a cramped space furnished with mismatched chairs salvaged from the street, and a table constructed from planks laid across beer barrels. The walls were decorated with newspaper clippings, describing various crimes, not as trophies, but as educational materials, examples of methods that had succeeded or failed in Birmingham's ongoing war between criminals and police. A collection of weapons hung from nails driven into the wall, razors in various stages of sharpening, weighted clubs called life preservers, knuckle dusters fashioned from lead and brass, and knives designed specifically for close-quarters fighting in Birmingham's narrow alleyways. On this particular evening, Mucklow counted coins extracted from illegal bookmakers throughout his territory, his scarred hands sorting the money into piles that represented different sources of revenue. Protection money from pub landlords, who paid weekly tribute to ensure their establishments remained unmolested by gang violence, percentages from thieves who fenced stolen goods through criminal networks that Mucklow controlled, profits from illegal gambling operations that flourished in the shadows of Birmingham's legal economy. Each coin represented fear converted into currency, power measured in shillings and pounds extracted from men too frightened to refuse his demands. The system Mucklow had established was both simple and effective. Every legitimate business in his territory paid a weekly tribute calculated according to their ability to bear the cost. Prosperous establishments paid more, struggling shops paid less, but everyone paid something. The money bought protection, not from external threats, but from Mucklow's own gang, creating a circular arrangement where the same organisation that created the danger also provided the solution. Business owners who refused to participate discovered that their windows broke mysteriously, their stock disappeared overnight, and their customers found reasons to shop elsewhere. Illegal enterprises faced even more direct control. Bookmakers who operated without Mucklow's permission found themselves beaten unconscious and robbed of their day's receipts, while those who paid the required percentage operated under protection that was both genuine and ruthlessly enforced. Thieves who attempted to work his territory without authorization were subjected to violence that exceeded anything the police might inflict, creating an incentive structure that channeled criminal activity through Mucklow's organization rather than competing with it. The enforcement of Mucklow's authority was delegated to a carefully selected crew of young men who had proven their loyalty through participation in increasingly violent crimes. Danny McClure specialized in debt collection, employing methods that included breaking fingers, crushing kneecaps, and cutting facial scars that marked defaulters as examples for other potential debtors. Billy Hartwell served as Mucklow's personal enforcer, handling challenges to gang authority with a combination of razor blade and weighted club that left opponents permanently disfigured when they survived at all. Mickey O'Brien coordinated the gang's intelligence network, maintaining relationships with barmaids, shop assistants, and street children who provided information about police movements, rival gang activities, and potential targets for robbery or extortion. His sources were motivated by a combination of small payments and large threats, understanding that betraying Mucklow's trust would result in consequences that made cooperation with the police seem like a death sentence by comparison. The physical territory that Mucklow controlled encompassed Garrison Lane, Coventry Street, and portions of the surrounding residential areas, a domain that could be walked from end to end in less than 30 minutes, but which contained several hundred families, dozens of shops, and numerous illegal enterprises that provided the economic foundation for his criminal organization. Every resident of this area understood the boundaries of Mucklow's kingdom and the consequences of crossing them, creating an invisible but absolute border that was enforced through public displays of violence that served as education for anyone tempted to challenge established order. The challenges to Mucklow's authority came regularly and were met with responses calibrated to ensure that each victory strengthened his reputation while discouraging future rebellions. When boys from the Aston district attempted to collect protection money from shops on Coventry Street, Mucklow's response was swift and public. The three intruders were captured, beaten unconscious, and then branded with hot iron to mark them permanently as examples of what happened to those who trespassed on his territory. They survived, but their scars ensured that everyone who saw them understood the price of challenging Mucklow's authority. A more serious threat emerged when Billy Morrison, a dock worker who had served time in Winson Green Prison for assault, attempted to establish his own protection racket among the pubs of Small Heath. Morrison possessed both the physical strength and violent reputation necessary for criminal leadership, but he lacked understanding of the psychological warfare that maintained gang control in Birmingham's industrial districts. His approach was direct, but unsubtle. He demanded money from pub landlords and beat those who refused, assuming that physical intimidation alone would establish his authority. Mucklow's response demonstrated the sophistication that separated successful gang leaders from ordinary thugs. Rather than confronting Morrison directly, he arranged for the man's sister to be kidnapped and held prisoner in an abandoned factory building, then sent word that she would be released unharmed if Morrison left Birmingham permanently. When Morrison refused and attempted to rescue his sister, he walked into an ambush that had been carefully planned to inflict maximum psychological impact. The confrontation took place in the factory where Morrison's sister was being held, a cavernous space filled with abandoned machinery that created perfect acoustics for screams to echo and multiply. Morrison arrived with two allies, believing that superior numbers would compensate for lack of planning, but discovered that Mucklow had anticipated his arrival and prepared accordingly. The building had been rigged with tripwires that sent Morrison's companions crashing into concealed pits filled with broken glass, while Morrison himself was captured through the simple expedient of dropping a weighted net from the factory's rafters. The torture that followed was designed not merely to inflict pain, but to create a story that would be repeated throughout Birmingham's criminal underworld for years to come. Morrison was subjected to techniques that Mucklow had learned from veterans of colonial wars, methods that maximized suffering while ensuring survival, creating living testimonies to the consequences of challenging established gang authority. His sister was forced to watch, understanding that her own safety depended on her brother's willingness to submit completely to Mucklow's demands. Morrison's surrender was absolute and public, conducted in the Garrison Tavern before an audience of criminals, pub landlords, and residents who had been summoned to witness the restoration of proper order. He knelt before Mucklow, acknowledged his authority over Small Heath, and begged permission to leave Birmingham with his sister. The permission was granted, but only after Morrison had been branded with a hot iron that left Mucklow's initials permanently burned into his forehead, ensuring that he would carry evidence of his defeat wherever his travels might take him. The incident established Mucklow's reputation throughout Birmingham's interconnected criminal networks, demonstrating that his authority extended beyond mere physical violence to include psychological warfare that could break strong men through carefully applied pressure on their emotional vulnerabilities. His willingness to target family members showed potential rivals that challenging his gang meant putting everyone they cared about at risk, creating deterrent effects that extended far beyond the immediate participants in any conflict. By 1896, Mucklow's criminal organization had evolved into something resembling a parallel government within his territory, providing services that the legitimate authorities either could not or would not offer. Disputes between residents were arbitrated according to Mucklow's judgment rather than legal precedent, with decisions enforced through methods that were swift, final, and absolutely binding. Businesses that suffered losses through theft or vandalism could appeal to Mucklow for justice that was both more certain and more severe than anything Birmingham's overworked police force could provide. The success of Mucklow's enterprise attracted attention from similar organizations throughout Birmingham, creating opportunities for alliance, trade, and territorial expansion that would transform the city's criminal landscape during the final years of the 19th century. His methods would be copied, refined, and adapted by gang leaders throughout England's industrial cities, establishing patterns of organized crime that would persist well into the 20th century and beyond. Thomas Mucklow had created more than just a criminal gang. He had established a model for urban organized crime that combined traditional gangster methods with innovative approaches to psychological warfare, territorial control, and community relations. His kingdom in Small Heath demonstrated that working-class youth could create their own power structures when legitimate society offered them no alternatives, building empires from nothing but willingness to embrace violence that civilized men preferred to ignore. Chapter 4. The Racecourse Blood War. The spring meeting at Cheltenham Racecourse on March 15, 1921, dawned with the kind of crisp morning air that promised good racing and better profits for the illegal bookmakers who operated in the shadows of England's sporting establishments. Billy Kimber adjusted his bowler hat as he surveyed the growing crowds from his position near the paddock, his keen eyes calculating the day's potential earnings, while his crew of Birmingham Boys prepared for what would become the bloodiest gang confrontation in the history of English racing. Across the grounds, Charles Sabini's London mob was making similar preparations, their expensive suits and polished shoes marking them as invaders in what Kimber considered his rightful territory. The illegal betting industry that flourished at England's racecourses was worth thousands of pounds to whichever organisation could control it, representing far more than the petty street crimes that had characterised gang activities in previous decades. Licensed bookmakers operated under government regulation and paid taxes on their profits, but the illegal operators who served punters wanting to place bets without official scrutiny generated pure profit that flowed directly into criminal coffers. Control of the betting rings meant control of protection rackets, information networks, and the tribute payments that every small-time criminal was forced to contribute to whichever gang dominated their territory. Kimber's Birmingham Boys had established their dominance over racing in the English Midlands through methods that combined business acumen with brutal violence, creating an organisation that was both more sophisticated and more dangerous than the street gangs from which it had evolved. Unlike the territorial disputes that characterised urban gang warfare, The racecourse battles involved mobile operations that required careful planning, reliable intelligence, and the ability to deploy substantial numbers of armed men at specific locations on predetermined dates. The Birmingham Boys who accompanied Kimber to Cheltenham represented the elite of his criminal organisation. Men who had proven their loyalty through participation in previous battles and demonstrated their usefulness through specialised skills that ranged from razor fighting to debt collection. Danny Sullivan served as Kimber's lieutenant, coordinating the movement of personnel and weapons while maintaining the communication networks that kept the gang informed about police activities and rival gang movements. Mickey O'Brien handled intelligence gathering, using a network of stable boys, jockeys and racing officials who provided information about upcoming meetings, security arrangements, and the activities of competing organisations. Harry Fowler led the Birmingham Boys enforcement arm, commanding a crew of 20 men whose weapons included razors, weighted clubs, knuckle dusters, and knives designed specifically for close-quarters combat in crowded locations. These were not the improvised weapons of street thugs, but professionally crafted instruments of violence created by blacksmiths who understood the specific requirements of gang warfare and were paid well for their discretion. Each man carried multiple weapons concealed about his person, understanding that racecourse battles could erupt without warning and that survival depended on being better armed than the opposition. Sabini's London mob represented a different evolution of criminal organisation, one that emphasised connections with corrupt officials over pure violence, though their capacity for brutality was equal to anything Birmingham could produce. Charles Sabini himself was a man of considerable intelligence and ruthless ambition, who had built his criminal empire through careful cultivation of relationships with police officers, magistrates, and racing officials who could be bought, blackmailed, or intimidated into cooperation. His organisation operated throughout London and the southern counties, generating revenue from illegal gambling, protection rackets, and various forms of organised theft that required coordination across multiple jurisdictions. The conflict between Kimber and Sabini had been building for months as their respective territories expanded and began to overlap, creating friction that was inevitable when two successful criminal organisations competed for the same resources. Previous confrontations had been limited to threats and minor violence, but the stakes at Cheltenham were too high for either side to back down without a fight that would establish dominance over England's most lucrative illegal betting operations. The morning racing proceeded normally, with legitimate punters placing bets and enjoying the spectacle, while the two gangs manoeuvred for position in the areas where illegal bookmakers operated. The atmosphere was tense but controlled, with both sides aware that premature action could bring unwanted police attention that would ruin the day's profit for everyone involved. But as the afternoon's feature race approached, the inevitable confrontation began to unfold, with the deadly precision of a military operation. The spark that ignited the violence was a dispute over the placement of illegal betting pitches near the grandstand, where the most affluent punters gathered and the potential profits were highest. One of Sabini's men attempted to establish a betting operation in an area that Kimber's organisation had controlled for the previous 2 seasons, leading to an exchange of threats that quickly escalated beyond the possibility of peaceful resolution. Within minutes, word had spread through both gangs that the time for negotiation had passed and the moment for violence had arrived. The battle began with Danny Sullivan's razor opening Tommy Morrison's throat to the spine, sending arterial spray across the perfectly manicured grass as the London gangster collapsed in convulsions that would continue until his heart stopped beating. The sight of blood served as a signal to both sides, and within seconds the betting area had become a battlefield, where dozens of men fought with weapons that had been concealed but were now employed with lethal efficiency. Billy McCann used his weighted sock filled with ball bearings to crush the skull of a Sabini enforcer who had drawn a knife, the impact producing a sound like breaking crockery as bone fragments penetrated brain tissue. The London gangster dropped instantly, his body continuing to twitch while blood pooled beneath his shattered head. McCann stepped over the corpse and moved toward his next target, a well-dressed man whose expensive suit could not protect him from Birmingham steel, applied with professional competence. Harry Fowler fought with the methodical efficiency of a man who understood that gang warfare was ultimately about breaking the enemy's will to resist through demonstration of superior violence. His knuckle dusters, weighted with lead and sharpened to razor edges, opened faces and crushed bones with each punch, leaving opponents marked for life when they survived at all. He moved through the crowd of fighting men like a farmer harvesting grain, his movements economical and precise as he inflicted damage calculated to terrorize observers while eliminating immediate threats. The Sabini gang's response was equally professional and considerably more ruthless. Italian Joe used a knife designed for gutting fish to open Billy Hartwell's abdomen, spilling intestines onto the grass while the Birmingham gangster screamed and tried to hold his organs inside his body. The wound was fatal, but not immediately so, ensuring that Hartwell's agony would serve as psychological warfare against his associates while they watched him die slowly and painfully. Razor Charlie employed the traditional London technique of facial slashing, his blade opening cuts from ear to mouth that would mark Birmingham men permanently as examples of what happened to those who challenged Sabini's authority. Unlike the Birmingham gang's preference for immediate killing, the London mob specialised in inflicting wounds that would heal but leave scars that served as permanent advertisements for their willingness to employ extreme violence against rivals. The fighting spread throughout the betting area as more men joined the battle, some motivated by gang loyalty and others simply caught up in violence that had erupted around them. Racegoers fled in panic as the conflict expanded beyond the original participants, their terrified screams adding to the chaos, while police officers struggled to restore order through methods that were inadequate for controlling organised gang warfare conducted by men who had learned their trade in the trenches of France. The turning point came when Mickey O'Brien produced a pistol that he had acquired from a corrupt army quartermaster, the first firearm to be employed in what had previously been a conflict conducted with traditional gang weapons. His shot took down Frankie Mills, one of Sabini's most effective enforcers, the bullet opening a hole in his chest that exposed his heart to the afternoon air. The sound of gunfire sent the remaining racegoers into complete panic, while alerting police throughout the county that the situation had escalated beyond normal criminal violence. The arrival of additional police officers, summoned by telephone calls from racing officials who understood that uncontrolled gang warfare would destroy their profitable operations, finally forced both sides to disengage and retreat. The immediate battle had lasted less than 20 minutes, but it had transformed the betting area into a scene that resembled a battlefield from the recently concluded war. 7 men lay dead on grass that was soaked with blood, while dozens of others had suffered wounds that would mark them permanently as veterans of England's most violent gang confrontation. The aftermath of the Cheltenham battle established new parameters for gang warfare throughout England, demonstrating that criminal organisations had evolved beyond street thuggery to become military-style units capable of coordinating complex operations across multiple jurisdictions. The violence also attracted unprecedented attention from government authorities, who had previously regarded gang activities as local police matters rather than national security concerns. Billy Kimber's Birmingham Boys had technically won the battle, maintaining control over their established territory, while inflicting slightly more casualties than they had suffered. But the victory came at a cost that included increased police surveillance, government investigation, and the attention of newspaper reporters who would ensure that future gang activities received public scrutiny that complicated criminal operations throughout England. The blood that soaked into Cheltenham's grass would not wash away with the next rain, but would seep into the soil as a permanent reminder that the romanticized world of English horse racing concealed criminal enterprises that were willing to wage war for control of illegal profits. The gentleman's sport had been revealed as a battlefield where working-class criminals fought for territory with weapons and methods that exceeded anything employed by the armies that had recently fought in foreign wars. Chapter 5. The Women Who Cut Deeper. In the cramped kitchen of her terraced house on Bordsley Green, Annie Fletcher stood before her 15-year-old daughter Margaret, demonstrating the proper technique for concealing a razor blade within the elaborate hairstyles that were fashionable among Birmingham's working-class women in the spring of 1922. The blade, sharpened to surgical precision on the kitchen's whetstone, disappeared completely within the twisted coils of hair that Margaret had spent an hour arranging, according to her mother's exacting instructions. To casual observation, the girl appeared to be dressed for Sunday service, but Annie knew that her daughter now carried death, concealed within an arrangement that would fool police officers and rival gang members alike. The blade must sit against the scalp, Annie explained, in the patient tone she used when teaching skills that could determine the difference between life and death in Birmingham's criminal underworld, positioned so that you can reach it with either hand, but held secure enough that it won't fall out during a struggle. Practice the motion until you can draw steel and open a man's throat in less time than it takes him to blink. Speed is everything when you're fighting someone twice your size and 3 times your strength. Annie Fletcher had earned her reputation through methods that exceeded the brutality employed by most male criminals, establishing herself as one of Birmingham's most feared gang leaders through willingness to employ violence that shocked even hardened thugs who had learned their trade in foreign wars. Unlike the men who fought for territory and profit, Annie's motivation was protection of her family and preservation of the criminal enterprise that provided the only income available to a widow with 4 children, in a city where legitimate employment for women paid starvation wages. The Fletcher gang operated throughout the neighbourhoods surrounding Bordsley Green, controlling illegal gambling operations, fencing stolen goods, and providing enforcement services for other criminal organisations that preferred to outsource their violence to specialists who could be trusted to complete assignments without asking unnecessary questions. Annie's crew consisted entirely of women whose circumstances had forced them into criminal careers. Widows whose husbands had died in industrial accidents or foreign wars. Unmarried mothers whose children needed food regardless of how that food was obtained. And daughters of criminal families who had learned that survival required embracing skills that respectable society preferred to ignore. Margaret Fletcher represented the next generation of criminal leadership, trained from childhood in techniques that combined traditional feminine roles with deadly competence in gang warfare. At 15, she could pick pockets with fingers light enough to extract coins without detection, seduce information from male criminals who underestimated her intelligence, and kill with weapons that could be concealed within clothing designed to emphasize feminine helplessness rather than lethal capability. The education that Annie provided for her daughter included lessons that no government school would ever teach: how to use corset stays sharpened to stiletto points as weapons that could penetrate a man's ribs and reach his heart, how to prepare poisons that would kill slowly enough to avoid immediate suspicion, but quickly enough to prevent retaliation, how to employ seduction as a weapon more deadly than any blade, luring male victims into vulnerable positions where traditional physical advantages became meaningless. The kitchen itself served as both classroom and armory, its domestic appearance concealing an arsenal of weapons designed specifically for use by women who understood that success in gang warfare required adapting traditional tools to serve deadly purposes. Sewing needles were sharpened and weighted to serve as throwing weapons. Kitchen knives were rebalanced and rehoned to achieve perfect cutting efficiency. Even household cleaning products were stockpiled and modified to create acids that could blind enemies or explosives that could destroy rival operations. Violence is not about strength, Annie continued her instruction as Margaret practiced drawing the concealed razor with movements that were becoming smooth and instinctive, but about timing, surprise, and absolute commitment to inflicting maximum damage before your opponent can respond. Men expect women to scream and flee when confronted with danger. When you respond with steel instead of surrender, you gain precious seconds that can determine whether you live or die. The Fletcher gang's reputation had been established during a territorial dispute with male criminals from Aston who had made the mistake of assuming that women could be intimidated through threats that would have been effective against other men. The conflict began when Danny Morrison's crew attempted to take over gambling operations that Annie's organisation had controlled for 3 years, confident that feminine opposition could be overcome through demonstrations of superior physical strength and traditional masculine aggression. Annie's response had been swift, decisive, and educational, for any criminals who might be tempted to underestimate the determination of women fighting for the survival of their families. Rather than confronting Morrison's gang directly, she arranged for their leader to be seduced by one of her most attractive operatives, a young woman named Mary Sullivan, whose beauty concealed skills that had been developed through years of criminal apprenticeship under Annie's demanding tutelage. The seduction took place in the back room of the Rose and Crown pub, where Morrison had been lured by promises of information about police activities that could benefit his illegal operations. Mary had dressed for the occasion in clothing that emphasized her feminine vulnerability, while concealing weapons that included a razor blade sewn into her undergarments and a sharpened hairpin that could penetrate a man's brain through his ear canal with minimal pressure. Morrison's death had been both intimate and horrifying, conducted in the privacy of a locked room where his screams would be muffled by the pub's thick walls and the noise of drinking customers who had no interest in investigating sounds that might bring unwanted police attention. Mary had allowed Morrison to undress her partially before drawing the concealed razor and opening his throat with a cut so deep that it severed his vocal cords, preventing him from crying out while arterial blood sprayed across the room's grimy walls. The discovery of Morrison's mutilated corpse had sent shockwaves throughout Birmingham's criminal community, demonstrating that women could employ violence that exceeded anything male gangs were prepared to inflict or defend against. The psychological impact of the killing was enhanced by the intimate circumstances of Morrison's death, which suggested that no man was safe from feminine vengeance, regardless of his physical strength or criminal reputation. Annie's crew had followed up their leader's death with systematic elimination of his key associates, using methods that combined traditional gang warfare with techniques that exploited masculine assumptions about feminine helplessness. Jimmy McCann was killed by a poisoned drink served by a barmaid who had been recruited into the Fletcher organization. Billy Hartwell died when a woman he had attempted to assault produced a knife and opened his abdomen from ribs to pelvis, spilling his intestines onto the street while he screamed for help that would not arrive in time to save his life. The women of Birmingham's criminal underworld proved to be more ruthless than their male counterparts precisely because they had fewer options for survival in a society that offered working-class women limited alternatives to prostitution, domestic service, or criminal enterprise. Their desperation made them willing to employ methods that shocked male criminals who had grown accustomed to violence but were unprepared for opponents who fought with the ferocity of mothers protecting their children from starvation. Alice Diamond represented another evolution of feminine criminal leadership, having established herself as the undisputed queen of London's female gangs through methods that combined business acumen with ruthless elimination of rivals who challenged her authority. Her organisation specialised in shoplifting operations that stripped department stores of valuable merchandise, confidence schemes that defrauded wealthy victims of substantial sums, and enforcement services that were contracted by male gangs who recognized the advantages of employing women for certain types of criminal operations. Diamond's crew operated with military precision, conducting raids on commercial establishments that were planned with the thoroughness of bank robberies and executed with efficiency that left few traces for police investigators to follow. Her women could strip a shop of its valuable inventory within minutes, using techniques that involved systematic coordination among team members who understood their specific roles and responsibilities within larger criminal enterprises. The techniques employed by Diamond's organization included methods that exploited social expectations about feminine behavior to gain access to locations that would have been heavily guarded against male intruders. Well-dressed women could enter expensive shops, private homes, and exclusive establishments without attracting the suspicion that would have been directed toward working-class men attempting similar intrusions. Once inside, they could conduct reconnaissance, identify valuable targets, and plan future operations that would be executed with precision that professional thieves could only admire. The violence employed by female gangs was often more personal and more devastating than the impersonal brutality that characterized male criminal organizations. Women fought not just for territory or profit, but for the survival of their families, creating motivations that made them willing to inflict damage that exceeded anything male opponents were prepared to endure or reciprocate. Their weapons were often improvised from domestic items, but they were employed with creativity and ruthlessness that made them devastatingly effective against enemies who underestimated feminine capacity for violence. The partnership between male and female criminal organizations created power structures that were both more flexible and more dangerous than single-gender gangs, combining masculine physical strength with feminine cunning to create enterprises that could adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining the capacity for extreme violence when peaceful methods proved inadequate. These mixed organizations dominated Birmingham's criminal landscape during the 1920s, establishing patterns of cooperation that would influence organised crime throughout England for decades to come. The women who participated in Birmingham's gang warfare were not victims of masculine violence, but active participants in criminal enterprises that offered them alternatives to poverty, domestic servitude, and the limited opportunities available to working-class women in post-war England. Their choice to embrace violence was pragmatic rather than ideological, representing rational responses to social conditions that offered few legitimate paths to economic security or personal autonomy. Chapter 6. Police Corruption and Complicity. Detective Chief Inspector Reginald Spooner pocketed the £5 note that Billy Kimber had pressed into his palm during their brief handshake outside the Rose and Crown pub, the transaction completed with the practiced discretion of men who had conducted similar business dozens of times before. The money represented a week's wages for most Birmingham residents, but for Spooner, it was merely the latest installment in a relationship that had made him wealthy, while allowing the city's most notorious gang leader to operate with virtual impunity from law enforcement that should have been his greatest threat. The corruption that permeated Birmingham's police force in 1922 was not merely a matter of individual officers supplementing their inadequate salaries, but a systematic arrangement that had transformed law enforcement from a barrier to criminal activity into a service industry that protected gang operations in exchange for regular payments and information about rival organizations. The relationship between police and criminals had evolved beyond simple bribery to become a partnership that served both sides while victimizing the working-class communities that both were supposed to protect. Spooner's rise through the ranks of Birmingham's police had been facilitated by his understanding that effective law enforcement required working relationships with the criminal organizations that actually controlled the city's streets. His superiors, who maintained public facades of moral rectitude while privately acknowledging their inability to combat organized crime through traditional methods, rewarded officers who could maintain order regardless of the techniques employed to achieve that stability. The arrangement between Spooner and Kimber was both complex and mutually beneficial, extending far beyond simple protection from arrest to include intelligence sharing that helped both organizations eliminate common enemies. Spooner provided advance warning of planned raids, testimony that could be used to convict rival gang members, and evidence that could be manipulated to support charges against criminals who had fallen out of favor with the established power structure. In return, Kimber's organization provided information about criminal activities that Spooner could use to enhance his reputation as an effective detective, ensuring that his arrest statistics remained impressive while focusing law enforcement attention on criminals who posed no threat to the profitable arrangements that had made both men wealthy. The Birmingham Boys also served as an unofficial enforcement arm for police objectives that could not be achieved through legal methods, intimidating witnesses who might testify against corrupt officers, and eliminating criminals whose activities threatened the delicate balance that kept the system functioning. The weekly meeting between Spooner and Kimber took place in the back room of various public houses throughout Birmingham, locations that changed regularly to avoid establishing patterns that might attract attention from honest police officers or government investigators who remained unaware of the arrangements that actually governed criminal justice in England's industrial cities. The conversations were brief and businesslike, focusing on practical matters that affected both men's operations without dwelling on moral implications that both had learned to ignore. "The Sabini boys are planning something for next week's racing at Warwick," Kimber informed Spooner during their latest conference, his voice carrying the casual tone of a businessman discussing market conditions with an associate. "Word is they're bringing 30 men up from London, armed with more than razors. Might be a good time for your lads to be looking the other way, if you catch my meaning." Spooner nodded his understanding while making mental calculations about the additional payments that such cooperation would require, balancing the risks of allowing major gang warfare against the profits that could be extracted from all parties involved in the conflict. "My men will be investigating reports of suspicious activity in Small Heath that day," he replied, "which should keep us busy enough to avoid any unpleasantness at the racecourse, though I'll need something extra to ensure their complete attention remains focused on other matters." The negotiation that followed was conducted with the politeness of gentlemen discussing business arrangements, though both men understood that their partnership was maintained through mutual threats that made betrayal suicidal for either party. Spooner possessed evidence that could send Kimber to the gallows, while Kimber controlled information that could expose corruption extending throughout Birmingham's police hierarchy and into the city government itself. The corruption extended far beyond individual officers to include magistrates who dismissed charges against favoured criminals, court clerks who lost crucial evidence, and prison officials who ensured that gang leaders served their sentences in comfort, while rival criminals suffered additional punishment beyond what the law prescribed. The entire criminal justice system had been transformed into a tool that served the interests of established criminal organizations, while maintaining the appearance of legitimate law enforcement for public consumption. Magistrate Harold Whitfield represented the judicial branch of Birmingham's corrupt criminal justice system, a man whose court decisions were influenced more by payments received from criminal defendants than by evidence presented during trials. His reputation for fairness had been earned through careful attention to ensuring that guilty verdicts were delivered against criminals who had failed to make appropriate financial arrangements, while innocent verdicts were provided for those who understood the economic realities of Birmingham's legal system. Whitfield's corruption was sophisticated and difficult to detect, involving legal technicalities and procedural errors that resulted in case dismissals, rather than obvious bias that might attract unwanted attention from superior courts. Evidence would be ruled inadmissible due to minor police mistakes. Witnesses would be discredited through revelation of past criminal activities, and charges would be reduced to levels that transform serious felonies into minor infractions punishable by small fines rather than lengthy prison sentences. The prison system itself had been compromised through arrangements that allowed wealthy criminals to purchase comfortable accommodations and special privileges, while serving sentences that were nominally the same as those imposed on ordinary prisoners. Gang leaders could continue directing their criminal operations from prison cells that functioned as offices, receiving visitors who brought information and carried instructions back to associates operating on Birmingham's streets. Governor James Morrison of Winson Green Prison had transformed his institution into a hotel for criminals who could afford luxury accommodations, while maintaining harsh conditions for prisoners who lacked the financial resources necessary to purchase humane treatment. The arrangement generated substantial income for Morrison and his staff, while ensuring that imprisonment posed no serious threat to criminal organizations that had established appropriate financial relationships with corrections officials. The systematic corruption that characterized Birmingham's criminal justice system was not unique to that city, but reflected conditions that existed throughout England's industrial centres, where rapid urban growth had overwhelmed traditional law enforcement methods, while creating opportunities for organised crime that exceeded anything previously seen in British history. Police forces that had been designed to handle individual criminals and minor disturbances found themselves confronting military-style organisations that possessed superior weapons, better intelligence networks, and financial resources that could corrupt anyone whose integrity was for sale. The relationship between corrupt police officers and criminal organisations created perverse incentives that actually increased crime rates, while providing the appearance of effective law enforcement through manipulation of arrest statistics and conviction rates. Police focused their attention on independent criminals who lacked the resources to purchase protection, while ignoring organised criminal enterprises that generated the most significant threats to public safety and order. The victims of this corrupted system were primarily working-class residents who could not afford to purchase police protection or judicial fairness, leaving them vulnerable to criminal predation while the authorities who should have defended them served the interests of their oppressors instead. The police became just another gang competing for territory and tribute, distinguished from criminal organisations primarily by their uniforms and legal authority, rather than by their methods or moral purposes. Detective Sergeant William Thompson represented the minority of honest police officers who attempted to combat both criminal gangs and official corruption, but found themselves isolated and threatened by colleagues who viewed integrity as a threat to profitable arrangements that benefited everyone except the general public. Thompson's efforts to investigate gang activities were consistently undermined by intelligence leaks, evidence tampering, and bureaucratic obstacles that made effective law enforcement virtually impossible. The few honest officers who persisted in their efforts to combat organised crime faced retaliation that could include professional sabotage, physical threats, and elimination through methods that were designed to appear accidental, rather than deliberate assassination. The criminal organisations that had purchased police protection were willing to defend their investments through violence that exceeded anything they employed against rival gangs, understanding that maintaining corrupt relationships was essential to their continued operation. The corruption of Birmingham's criminal justice system represented more than individual moral failure, but reflected the systematic breakdown of governmental institutions when confronted with criminal organisations that possessed resources and capabilities that exceeded those available to law enforcement agencies. The gangs had evolved beyond the capacity of traditional policing methods to control, creating conditions that favoured corruption over confrontation as the most practical approach to managing criminal activities that could not be eliminated through legal means. Chapter 7. The Pub Wars. The Garrison Tavern stood like a fortress at the corner of Garrison Lane and Coventry Street, its thick brick walls scarred by decades of violence, while its interior reeked of spilled beer, tobacco smoke, and the metallic scent of blood that no amount of scrubbing could completely remove. In the autumn of 1923, this establishment served as the unofficial headquarters for Thomas Gilbert's crew, a fact that made it a prime target for Mickey O'Brien's Aston gang, who understood that controlling Birmingham's public houses meant controlling the illegal gambling, stolen goods trafficking, and protection rackets that generated the bulk of criminal profits throughout the city's working-class districts. The pub wars that consumed Birmingham during the early 1920s were fought not for territory measured in streets or neighbourhoods, but for individual establishments that served as nerve centres for criminal networks, extending throughout England's industrial heartland. Each public house represented a fortress that could provide sanctuary for gang members, a marketplace for illegal transactions, and a recruitment centre for criminals seeking employment in enterprises that offered better pay than legitimate labour. The battle for the Garrison Tavern would demonstrate that these struggles involved more than business competition, but represented warfare between criminal armies that were prepared to employ methods that exceeded anything seen during the recently concluded European conflict. Gilbert's claim to the garrison was based on 3 years of systematic intimidation that had driven away rival gangs while establishing relationships with local residents who understood that cooperation with his organisation offered better protection than reliance on Birmingham's corrupt and ineffective police force. His men collected tribute from every illegal gambling operation within a half-mile radius of the pub, fenced stolen goods through networks that extended into London's criminal markets, and provided enforcement services for other gangs that lacked the manpower or expertise necessary to handle their own violence. The pub's landlord, William Hartley, had long since accepted that his establishment served purposes that extended far beyond the legal sale of alcoholic beverages, understanding that resistance to Gilbert's organisation would result in consequences that made cooperation seem like a wise business decision. Hartley received a percentage of the illegal profits generated through his premises, while maintaining plausible deniability about criminal activities that technically occurred without his knowledge or consent. Mickey O'Brien's challenge to Gilbert's control was motivated by more than simple greed, though the potential profits from capturing the garrison were substantial enough to justify considerable risks. O'Brien had established his own criminal enterprise in Aston through methods that emphasized cunning over brute force, building networks of informants and corrupt officials that provided his organization with advantages that compensated for inferior numbers and firepower. His assessment of Gilbert's operation had identified weaknesses that could be exploited through careful planning and ruthless execution. The assault on the garrison began at closing time on a Thursday evening in October, when the pub's clientele had been reduced to Gilbert's core supporters and a few dedicated drinkers who lacked the sense to recognize that they were about to witness violence that would be discussed in Birmingham's criminal underworld for years to come. O'Brien's men had spent weeks studying the pub's routines, identifying escape routes, and positioning weapons in locations that would provide tactical advantages during the confrontation they knew was inevitable. Danny Morrison, O'Brien's primary enforcer, had concealed himself in the pub's cellar earlier that day, armed with a shotgun that had been stolen from a sporting goods shop and modified to increase its effectiveness in close-quarters combat. His position beneath the pub's main floor allowed him to attack Gilbert's men from an unexpected direction, while creating confusion that would prevent organised resistance to the invasion that was about to commence. The first indication that something was amiss came when the pub's gas lights began to flicker and dim, the result of sabotage that O'Brien's men had conducted on the building's utilities to create an atmosphere of uncertainty and fear. In the gathering darkness, ordinary shadows became potential hiding places for enemies, while familiar furniture and fixtures transformed into obstacles that could conceal deadly threats. Gilbert sensed the danger before his associates, his instincts honed by years of survival in Birmingham's criminal underworld, where the ability to recognize impending violence often meant the difference between life and death. He reached for the razor concealed in his jacket, while scanning the pub's interior for threats that his experience told him were present despite the absence of obvious evidence. The explosion that followed Morrison's emergence from the cellar shattered the evening's apparent tranquility, sending wooden splinters and broken glass throughout the pub's main room, while the shotgun's blast caught Jimmy Fletcher in the chest, opening wounds that exposed his ribs to the smoky air. Fletcher's screams served as a signal to both sides that the battle for the garrison had begun in earnest, with no quarter expected or given by men who understood that defeat meant death or permanent disfigurement. Billy McCann responded to the attack with the weighted club that had earned him a reputation throughout Small Heath for brutality that exceeded even Birmingham's generous standards for criminal violence. His first swing crushed the skull of Tommy Walsh, one of O'Brien's men who had attempted to rush the bar where Gilbert's crew had taken defensive positions. The sound of breaking bone was audible even above the shouting and gunfire that had transformed the peaceful pub into a battlefield where survival required embracing savagery that civilized men preferred to ignore. The fighting spread throughout the pub's interior as more of O'Brien's men revealed their presence, emerging from hiding places that had been carefully selected to provide maximum tactical advantage during the assault they had planned for weeks. Razors flashed in the uncertain light as traditional gang weapons were employed with lethal efficiency, while improvised clubs and stolen pistols added elements of random destruction to violence that was otherwise conducted with professional competence. Harry Fowler found himself confronting 3 opponents simultaneously, his knuckle dusters proving inadequate against superior numbers that forced him to retreat toward the pub's back door, while blood from multiple wounds made his hands slippery and difficult to control. His survival depended on reaching weapons that Gilbert's crew had cached in the pub's rear courtyard, but the distance seemed infinite when measured against the closing speed of enemies who were determined to prevent his escape. The turning point in the battle came when Landlord Hartley, motivated by terror rather than loyalty to either side, revealed the location of additional weapons that Gilbert's men had stored in the pub's attic. O'Brien's assault had been planned around intelligence that failed to account for these reserve armaments, creating a tactical surprise that shifted the balance of power toward the defending gang at the crucial moment when their position seemed hopeless. Gilbert's access to these hidden weapons allowed him to arm civilians who had been trapped in the pub when the violence erupted, transforming terrified bystanders into reluctant participants in gang warfare that exceeded anything they had previously witnessed. A clerk from the local post office found himself wielding a meat cleaver against men who were trying to kill him for the crime of drinking in the wrong establishment at the wrong time, while a dock worker used a stolen police truncheon to defend himself against attackers whose motivations he neither understood nor cared to investigate. The involvement of civilians in the fighting created chaos that worked to Gilbert's advantage, as O'Brien's men found themselves unable to distinguish between legitimate targets and innocent bystanders who had been forced into combat by circumstances beyond their control. The resulting confusion disrupted the carefully planned assault, creating opportunities for Gilbert's crew to rally and launch a counterattack that would determine the evening's ultimate outcome. The counterattack was led by Gilbert himself, who fought with the desperate fury of a man defending not just his criminal enterprise, but his reputation as one of Birmingham's most dangerous gang leaders. His razor opened throats and severed arteries with surgical precision, while his boots crushed the bones of fallen enemies who had made the mistake of assuming that injury meant incapacitation. The pub's floors became slippery with blood that made movement treacherous for both sides, creating additional hazards in a battle that was already being fought under conditions that tested human endurance to its limits. Mickey Walsh, O'Brien's second-in-command, died when Gilbert's razor opened his carotid artery in a cut so deep that it severed his vocal cords, preventing him from warning his associates about the flanking maneuver that Gilbert was executing through the pub's kitchen. Walsh's death removed the tactical coordination that had made O'Brien's assault effective, leaving his men to fight as individuals rather than as components in a military-style operation. The battle's conclusion came when O'Brien himself was cornered in the pub's upstairs room, his escape routes cut off by Gilbert's men who had finally gained control of the building's strategic positions. The confrontation between the two gang leaders was brief but decisive, ending when Gilbert's knife found the gap between O'Brien's ribs and penetrated his heart with a thrust that was both accurate and fatal. O'Brien's death ended the assault on the garrison tavern, but the victory came at a cost that included 4 of Gilbert's men killed and 6 wounded seriously enough to require medical attention that could not be obtained through legitimate channels. The pub itself had been transformed into a slaughterhouse that would require extensive repairs before it could resume normal operations, while the neighbourhood had been educated in the consequences of gang warfare through demonstrations of violence that would influence criminal behaviour throughout Birmingham for years to come. The aftermath of the battle established Gilbert's reputation as one of Birmingham's most formidable gang leaders, while demonstrating that the city's pub wars involved stakes high enough to justify employment of methods that exceeded anything previously seen in English criminal enterprises. The Garrison Tavern had been defended successfully, but the cost of that defence had shown both criminal organisations and law enforcement authorities that Birmingham's gang warfare was escalating toward levels of violence that threatened to overwhelm the social structures that maintained order in England's industrial cities. The pub wars represented more than simple business competition, but reflected the transformation of English criminal enterprises from loosely organised street gangs into military-style organisations that were prepared to wage actual warfare for control of territory and resources that legitimate society had abandoned to criminal control. The battle for the Garrison Tavern had demonstrated that these conflicts would be resolved, not through negotiation or official intervention, but through violence that was limited only by the participants' capacity for inflicting and enduring brutality that exceeded anything their society had previously witnessed or imagined. Chapter 8. Industrial Theft and Black Market Empire. The Hercules Motor Works stood silent in the pre-dawn darkness of November 1924, its massive brick buildings containing millions of pounds worth of machinery, raw materials, and finished products that would soon be redistributed through criminal networks, extending throughout England and into continental Europe. Danny Sullivan crouched in the shadows outside the factory's main gate, watching the night watchman complete his hourly rounds, while calculating the precise timing that would allow his crew to breach the facility's defences and remove enough valuable merchandise to fund their operations for months to come. Sullivan's gang had spent weeks studying the factory's security arrangements, bribing workers for information about production schedules and storage locations, while mapping the complex network of buildings that housed Birmingham's industrial wealth. The Hercules Works manufactured motorcycles and automobile components that commanded premium prices in both legitimate and criminal markets, making it an ideal target for thieves who possessed the organizational skills necessary to convert stolen industrial goods into untraceable cash. The theft of industrial products represented a significant evolution in Birmingham's criminal enterprises, moving beyond the petty street crimes that had characterized earlier gang activities to embrace operations that required sophisticated planning, substantial manpower, and connections to black market networks that could absorb large quantities of stolen merchandise without attracting unwanted police attention. These crimes generated profits that exceeded anything available through traditional gang activities, while creating criminal organizations that resembled business enterprises more than simple street gangs. Sullivan's crew consisted of 12 men whose specialized skills had been developed through years of criminal apprenticeship in Birmingham's industrial districts. Tommy Morrison served as the group's intelligence officer, maintaining relationships with factory workers, security guards, and transportation employees who provided information about valuable shipments, security procedures, and police patrol schedules. His network of informants extended throughout Birmingham's industrial sector, creating an early warning system that allowed the gang to identify profitable opportunities while avoiding law enforcement attention. Mickey O'Brien handled logistics, coordinating the movement of personnel and equipment, while arranging for transportation of stolen goods to warehouses where they could be stored safely until black market buyers were located. His responsibilities included managing relationships with corrupt officials who ensured that police investigations remained ineffective, while maintaining the complex web of legitimate and criminal businesses that allowed the gang to launder their profits through apparently legal enterprises. The actual theft operations were directed by Billy McCann, whose experience in the British Army had provided him with skills that were directly applicable to criminal enterprises requiring military-style planning and execution. McCann understood the importance of reconnaissance, timing, and coordinated action in operations where failure could result in lengthy prison sentences or violent retaliation from rival organisations seeking to eliminate competition for Birmingham's most lucrative criminal opportunities. The breach of the Hercules Works began at precisely 3 o'clock in the morning, when Sullivan's intelligence indicated that the night watchman would be at the furthest point of his patrol route and unlikely to detect activities occurring near the factory's loading docks. The gang's entry was accomplished through a combination of lockpicking, glass cutting, and patient work that left no obvious evidence of forced entry, ensuring that the theft might not be discovered until the beginning of the next business day. Inside the factory, Sullivan's men moved with the precision of experienced professionals, following predetermined routes to storage areas that contained the most valuable and portable merchandise. Their targets had been selected based on detailed intelligence about market values, transportation requirements, and the likelihood of successful disposal through black market channels that could absorb stolen goods without creating traces that police investigators could follow. The stolen merchandise included precision-machined engine components that were essential for motorcycle and automobile manufacturing, finished motorcycles that could be quickly repainted and provided with forged identification numbers, and raw materials such as steel alloys and specialized chemicals that commanded premium prices in both legitimate and criminal markets. The total value of the theft exceeded £10,000, representing months or years of legitimate wages for working-class families throughout Birmingham. The removal of stolen goods from the factory required careful coordination among gang members, who understood that detection during this phase of the operation could result in immediate arrest and lengthy prison sentences. The merchandise was loaded onto vehicles that had been stolen specifically for this purpose, driven by men whose criminal records made them unemployable in legitimate transportation industries, but whose skills were invaluable for criminal enterprises requiring reliable and discreet logistics support. The stolen vehicles followed predetermined routes to warehouses throughout Birmingham that served as temporary storage facilities for merchandise awaiting distribution through black market networks. These warehouses were owned by legitimate businesses that provided cover for criminal activities, creating layers of legal protection that made police investigation extremely difficult, even when law enforcement agencies possessed accurate intelligence about the gang's operations. The conversion of stolen industrial goods into untraceable cash required access to black market networks that extended far beyond Birmingham's criminal community, involving corrupt business owners, crooked transportation companies, and criminal organizations operating throughout England and continental Europe. Sullivan's gang had established relationships with buyers who could absorb large quantities of stolen merchandise, or paying prices that represented substantial profits for the thieves who had assumed the risks of acquiring the goods illegally. The black market empire that processed Birmingham's stolen industrial products was both more sophisticated and more extensive than legitimate businesses operating in the same industries, offering services that included transportation, warehousing, documentation, and financial arrangements that legitimate enterprises could not match. Criminal organizations could provide immediate cash payments for stolen goods, while legitimate businesses required credit arrangements and formal contracts that created paper trails leading directly to criminal participants. The corruption that enabled these black market operations extended throughout Birmingham's business community, involving legitimate enterprises that served as fronts for criminal activities, while providing employment for gang members who needed cover identities that would satisfy police investigators and government tax collectors. Scrap metal dealers purchased stolen industrial materials without asking questions about their origins, while transportation companies moved merchandise without maintaining records that could be used as evidence in criminal prosecutions. Factory owners and business managers often cooperated with criminal organizations through arrangements that provided benefits to all parties involved in these illegal transactions. Insurance companies would pay claims for stolen merchandise, while business owners received cash payments from the criminals who had purchased their cooperation, creating incentive structures that made theft more profitable than legitimate business operations for enterprises that were struggling to compete in post-war economic conditions. The workers who provided intelligence for criminal organizations were motivated by wages that exceeded anything available through legitimate employment, while facing working conditions that were considerably more pleasant than industrial labor that destroyed health while providing barely adequate compensation. A factory worker could earn more money by providing information to criminal gangs than by working full-time in legitimate employment, creating economic incentives that ensured steady supplies of intelligence for criminal organizations planning industrial thefts. The success of Sullivan's theft from the Hercules works established new standards for criminal enterprise in Birmingham, demonstrating that organized gangs could successfully target industrial facilities that had previously been considered immune to criminal predation. The profits generated through this single operation exceeded the combined earnings of dozens of traditional gang activities, while the methods employed could be replicated throughout Birmingham's industrial sector, with modifications that reflected the specific security arrangements and valuable merchandise available at different facilities. The impact of industrial theft on Birmingham's legitimate economy was substantial and persistent, creating costs that extended far beyond the immediate value of stolen merchandise to include increased security expenses, higher insurance premiums, and reduced competitiveness in markets where criminal organizations could undercut legitimate businesses by selling stolen goods at prices that reflected only transportation and distribution costs rather than manufacturing expenses. The black market networks that processed stolen industrial goods also provided infrastructure for other criminal activities, including smuggling operations that brought foreign merchandise into England without paying customs duties, money laundering schemes that converted criminal profits into apparently legitimate assets, and corruption networks that purchased cooperation from officials whose honest performance of their duties would have interfered with criminal operations. The transformation of Birmingham's gangs from street-level criminals into sophisticated criminal enterprises that could successfully target industrial facilities represented a fundamental change in the nature of organised crime in England, creating organisations that were both more profitable and more dangerous than the territorial gangs that had preceded them. These criminal enterprises possessed resources that enabled them to corrupt officials, intimidate witnesses, and eliminate competition through methods that exceeded anything available to traditional law enforcement agencies. The industrial theft operations that Sullivan's gang had pioneered would be copied throughout England's industrial cities, creating criminal enterprises that could challenge legitimate businesses while generating profits that funded expansion into other illegal activities. The success of these operations demonstrated that criminal organizations had evolved beyond simple predation to become alternative economic systems that could compete effectively with legitimate enterprises while offering goods and services that legal businesses could not provide. Chapter 9. The General Strike Chaos. The morning of May 4th, 1926, brought an eerie silence to Birmingham's industrial districts as factory whistles failed to sound for the first time in living memory, while the absence of workers' footsteps on cobblestone streets created an atmosphere of impending chaos that every criminal organisation in the city recognised as an unprecedented opportunity for profit through violence. Billy Kimber stood at the window of his headquarters in Small Heath, watching police officers struggle to maintain order in neighbourhoods where normal authority had evaporated overnight, leaving power vacuums that would be filled by whoever possessed the courage and ruthlessness necessary to seize control of abandoned territory. The general strike that paralysed England's economy had been called by trade union leaders who underestimated the criminal forces they were unleashing through their disruption of the social structures that maintained order in industrial cities throughout the nation. Birmingham's gangs understood immediately that the withdrawal of workers from factories, the reduction of police patrols, and the collapse of normal governmental authority created conditions that favoured criminal enterprises over legitimate businesses and law-abiding citizens who had relied on official protection that was no longer available. Kimber's Birmingham Boys had prepared for this opportunity through months of intelligence gathering and resource accumulation, understanding that periods of social upheaval offered possibilities for territorial expansion and elimination of rivals that would be impossible during times of normal governmental control. The strike represented more than labour unrest to criminal organisations that viewed chaos as a business opportunity, requiring immediate exploitation before competitors could establish positions that would be difficult to dislodge once normal order was restored. The first target for Kimber's expansion was the territory controlled by Charles Morrison's Aston gang, whose leader had made the mistake of leaving Birmingham on business in London when the strike was declared, leaving his organisation without effective leadership during the crucial hours when territorial boundaries would be redrawn through violence that exceeded anything previously seen in England's industrial cities. Morrison's absence created a power vacuum that Kimber intended to fill permanently, eliminating a rival organisation while acquiring valuable assets that included illegal gambling operations, protection rackets, and black market networks that generated substantial profits. The assault on Morrison's territory began at dawn, when normal police patrols had been suspended due to the emergency conditions created by the strike, leaving criminal organizations free to wage warfare without interference from law enforcement agencies that were struggling to maintain basic order in neighborhoods where traditional authority had collapsed overnight. Kimber's men moved through Aston's streets like a conquering army, systematically eliminating Morrison's associates while seizing control of businesses that had been paying tribute to their absent leader. Danny Sullivan led the attack on Morrison's primary stronghold, the King's Head pub that served as headquarters for criminal operations throughout the Aston district. The building was defended by 8 of Morrison's men, who had been left behind to maintain territorial control, but they were outnumbered and outgunned by Sullivan's assault force that included 20 of Kimber's most experienced fighters, armed with weapons that had been acquired specifically for this operation. The battle for the King's Head lasted less than an hour, but the violence employed by both sides exceeded anything previously witnessed in Birmingham's gang warfare, demonstrating that the collapse of normal social order had removed restraints that had previously limited criminal organizations to methods that avoided attracting unwanted governmental attention. Sullivan's men employed military tactics learned during the recently concluded European War, using coordinated assaults and concentrated firepower to overwhelm defenders who had been trained for street fighting rather than military-style combat. The defenders' resistance was fierce, but ultimately futile, as Morrison's men discovered that their traditional gang warfare techniques were inadequate against opponents who had adopted military methods for urban combat. Tommy McCann died when Sullivan's shotgun opened his chest cavity, exposing his heart to the morning air, while blood sprayed across the pub's walls in patterns that would remain visible long after the building had been abandoned by both sides. Billy Hartwell survived long enough to use his razor on 2 of Sullivan's men, before a knife thrust between his ribs punctured his lung and left him drowning in his own blood. The capture of the King's Head provided Kimber's organization with access to Morrison's records, financial assets, and intelligence networks that revealed the full extent of the Aston Gang's criminal operations. The information discovered during the assault enabled Kimber to identify additional targets for expansion, while providing details about corrupt officials, business relationships, and criminal methods that could be adapted for use by his own organization. Meanwhile, throughout Birmingham's industrial districts, other criminal organizations were conducting similar operations, designed to exploit the chaos created by the general strike, while eliminating competitors who might challenge their expanded territorial claims once normal order was restored. The Sabini gang's Birmingham operations moved to seize control of illegal gambling at racecourses throughout the Midlands, while smaller criminal enterprises focused on looting businesses that had been abandoned by owners who feared that striking workers might destroy their property. The collapse of normal police authority had created conditions where criminal organizations could operate with complete impunity, conducting activities that would have been impossible during periods of effective law enforcement. Banks, shops, and warehouses throughout Birmingham were systematically robbed by criminal gangs that understood they would face no immediate consequences for actions that would normally result in swift arrest and prosecution. Mickey O'Brien's crew focused their attention on Birmingham's jewellery district, where expensive merchandise could be stolen and quickly converted into untraceable cash through black market networks that had been established specifically to handle goods acquired during periods of social upheaval. The thieves employed methods that included explosives to open safes, cutting tools to breach security barriers, and vehicles to transport large quantities of valuable merchandise to warehouses where it could be processed for illegal sale. The violence that accompanied these criminal operations was both more extensive and more brutal than anything Birmingham had previously experienced, as gang members understood that the temporary absence of legal consequences created opportunities for settling old scores and eliminating personal enemies who had been protected by social structures that no longer functioned effectively. Personal disputes that had been suppressed during periods of normal order erupted into deadly confrontations that left bodies scattered throughout the city's industrial districts. Harry Fowler used the chaos to eliminate Jimmy Fletcher, a rival gang member who had been courting the same woman, and whose continued existence Fowler viewed as an obstacle to his romantic aspirations. The murder was conducted in broad daylight on a crowded street, where witnesses would normally have summoned police assistance. But the strike had created conditions where violent crime was ignored by residents who understood that law enforcement was unavailable and that involvement in criminal disputes could result in retaliation that would extend to innocent family members. The general strike's impact on Birmingham's criminal organisations extended beyond immediate opportunities for territorial expansion and violent crime, to include long-term changes in the relationships between gangs that had previously maintained relatively stable boundaries through informal agreements and mutual deterrence. The chaos created by the strike disrupted these arrangements, while providing incentives for aggressive expansion that would reshape Birmingham's criminal landscape permanently. The strike also demonstrated that criminal organisations were better prepared than legitimate authorities to maintain order during periods of social upheaval, creating situations where residents turned to gang leaders for protection and dispute resolution services that governmental agencies could no longer provide effectively. This development established precedents for criminal organisations assuming governmental functions during future crises, while building relationships with civilian populations that would enhance their power and influence during normal times. Charles Sabini's response to the Birmingham situation involved dispatching reinforcements from London to support local operations, while establishing new territorial claims that would be maintained after the strike ended. His organisation understood that the temporary chaos provided opportunities for permanent expansion into markets that had previously been controlled by local gangs, creating possibilities for building a criminal empire that extended throughout England's industrial regions. The restoration of normal order following the strike's conclusion would require extensive negotiations between criminal organisations that had expanded their territories and influence during the period of governmental chaos. These negotiations would be conducted through methods that included both diplomatic discussions and violent confrontations, as gangs sought to maintain their gains while avoiding conflicts that might attract renewed governmental attention to their activities. The general strike of 1926 had provided Birmingham's criminal organisations with opportunities that exceeded their most optimistic expectations, enabling territorial expansion, elimination of rivals, and accumulation of resources that would fund future criminal enterprises for years to come. The chaos had also demonstrated that periods of social upheaval created conditions where criminal organisations could challenge governmental authority directly, while building alternative power structures that could compete effectively with legitimate institutions for control of urban populations and resources. Chapter 10. Children of the Streets. 10-year-old Johnny Fletcher crouched in the narrow alleyway between two back-to-back houses on Coventry Street, his small fingers working with practiced precision as he learned to fold a razor blade into a piece of cloth that would conceal the weapon, while allowing quick access during the street fights that were an inevitable part of childhood in Birmingham's gang territories. His instructor was his older brother Mickey, barely 14 himself but already bearing the facial scars that marked him as a veteran of conflicts that had claimed the lives of boys who lacked the skills necessary for survival in neighbourhoods where violence was a daily reality rather than an occasional threat. "Keep the sharp edge facing outward," Mickey explained with the patient tone of someone passing along knowledge that could determine the difference between life and death. "But make sure the cloth covers it completely when you're walking past the coppers. They've learned to recognise the signs of boys carrying steel, and a night in the cells means a beating that could leave you marked for life." The lesson was conducted in whispers, not from fear of police detection, but because rival gang members were always listening for information that could be used to identify vulnerable targets or plan attacks against enemies who had grown careless about operational security. The education that Johnny Fletcher received in Birmingham streets was both more comprehensive and more practical than anything available in the government schools that working-class children attended when their families could afford to send them, though the curriculum focused on skills that civilized society preferred to ignore. By age 8, Johnny could pick pockets with fingers light enough to extract coins without detection, identify police informants through subtle behavioural cues that marked them as dangerous to criminal enterprises, and navigate Birmingham's maze of alleys and back streets with the efficiency of a postal worker following familiar routes. The Fletcher family occupied a single room in a terraced house that they shared with 3 other families, creating living conditions where privacy was impossible and family disputes became neighbourhood entertainment. Johnny's father worked irregular shifts at a foundry when employment was available, returning home with his lungs full of metal dust and his body exhausted by labour that aged men decades beyond their actual years. His mother took in washing from wealthier districts, spending 14 hours a day bent over tubs of scalding water that left her hands permanently raw and her back curved from constant strain.
Neither parent possessed the time or energy necessary to supervise their children's activities closely, leaving Johnny and his siblings to educate themselves in the harsh curriculum that Birmingham's streets provided for working-class youth who lacked alternatives to criminal apprenticeship.
The absence of parental oversight was not neglect, but economic necessity, in households where adult survival required such complete dedication to wage labour that child-rearing became a luxury that few families could afford. The street education that Johnny received was provided by older boys who had learned that survival in Birmingham's criminal underworld required recruiting and training younger associates who could perform tasks that were too dangerous or too visible for established gang members to handle directly. Children could move through crowds without attracting police attention, enter buildings through openings too small for adult access, and serve as messengers for criminal communications that could not be trusted to written correspondence. Tommy Morrison, at 16 the acknowledged leader of the juvenile criminals operating in their neighbourhood, had established a training program that combined practical instruction in criminal techniques with theoretical education about the social structures that governed Birmingham's underworld. His students learned not only how to commit specific crimes, but also how to avoid detection, how to identify potential targets, and how to recognise the territorial boundaries that determined which criminal organisations controlled different areas of the city. The Kimber boys control everything from Garrison Lane to the canal, Morrison explained during one of his informal lectures, conducted in the ruins of a bombed factory that served as classroom and headquarters for juvenile criminal activities. While the Sabini gang claims the territory around the racecourse and the better pubs where gentlemen drink expensive whiskey. Cross into the wrong area without permission, and you'll learn why the older lads file their teeth to points and sew razor blades into their caps. The practical training that Johnny received included instruction in the use of weapons that were specifically designed for use by children whose physical limitations made traditional gang armaments impractical. Sharpened coins could be thrown with accuracy that would impress a circus performer, while remaining virtually undetectable during police searches. Weighted socks filled with ball bearings could crush adult skulls when wielded by children who understood the proper techniques for maximizing impact force. Even ordinary marbles became deadly weapons when thrown with sufficient force at targets whose anatomy made them vulnerable to small projectiles applied with precipitation. The recruitment of children into Birmingham's criminal organisations was systematic and sophisticated, involving identification of candidates whose family circumstances and personal characteristics made them suitable for criminal careers, while screening out individuals who might prove unreliable or susceptible to police pressure. Gang leaders understood that children who were recruited too young might lack the emotional stability necessary for criminal careers, while those who were approached too late might have already developed moral convictions that would interfere with criminal activities. Johnny's recruitment began when he was observed successfully stealing food from a market store, demonstrating both the manual dexterity and the emotional detachment necessary for criminal success. His technique was evaluated by older boys who reported their observations to gang leaders responsible for identifying promising candidates for criminal apprenticeship. The theft itself was less important than the methods employed and the candidate's reaction to successfully committing a crime against innocent victims. The initiation ceremony that marked Johnny's formal acceptance into criminal society was conducted in the basement of an abandoned church, where religious symbols provided ironic witness to activities that violated every moral principle that Christianity attempted to teach. The ritual involved demonstrations of loyalty, courage, and willingness to inflict violence against designated targets, ensuring that new recruits understood the absolute commitment that criminal careers required from participants who could not rely on legitimate alternatives for economic survival. "You're not a child anymore," Morrison told Johnny, as the ceremony concluded with the new recruit's successful completion of a robbery that had been designed to test his competence and commitment. "But you're not yet a man either. You're something different, a soldier in an army that fights for territory measured in streets and profits counted in shillings, extracted from people who work honest jobs and live boring lives. Remember that everything you do reflects on the organisation that has accepted you, and failure means consequences that extend far beyond personal punishment." The criminal apprenticeship that followed Johnny's initiation involved gradually increasing responsibilities that tested his abilities while providing education in advanced criminal techniques that were essential for career advancement within Birmingham's gang hierarchies. Initial assignments included serving as a lookout during burglaries, carrying messages between criminal associates and participating in minor thefts that generated modest profits while providing training in methods that would be essential for more lucrative criminal enterprises. The education Johnny received was comprehensive and practical, covering topics that included basic arithmetic for calculating profits and expenses, elementary geography for understanding territorial boundaries and escape routes, and rudimentary psychology for identifying potential victims and avoiding dangerous confrontations with rival gang members or law enforcement officers. The curriculum was more thorough than anything available in government schools that were designed to produce factory workers rather than independent entrepreneurs, even when those enterprises involved illegal activities. The loyalty that criminal organizations demanded from their juvenile recruits was absolute and permanent, extending beyond individual criminal activities to include personal relationships, family obligations, and future career decisions that would be subject to gang approval for the remainder of the recruit's life. Johnny understood that his commitment to criminal society was irrevocable, making legitimate career alternatives impossible, while ensuring that his survival would depend permanently on maintaining good relationships with criminal associates, who could provide protection or order his elimination, depending on his continued usefulness to their enterprises. The violence that was integral to criminal careers was introduced gradually through carefully controlled experiences that desensitized children to suffering, while teaching them to inflict pain efficiently and without emotional involvement. Johnny's first assignment requiring violence involved beating a shopkeeper who had refused to pay protection money, using methods that were designed to inflict maximum pain while minimizing permanent injury that might interfere with the victim's ability to continue earning money for criminal organizations. The psychological impact of criminal apprenticeship was profound and permanent, transforming children who might have developed into productive citizens into individuals whose capacity for empathy had been systematically destroyed through exposure to violence and criminal activity that normal society considered morally reprehensible. Johnny's emotional development was shaped by experiences that taught him to view other people as potential victims or threats, rather than fellow human beings deserving of consideration and respect. The financial rewards of criminal careers provided immediate gratification that made legitimate employment seem inadequate by comparison, creating economic incentives that reinforced the psychological conditioning that criminal organizations used to maintain loyalty among recruits, who might otherwise be tempted to abandon illegal activities in favor of honest work. Johnny's weekly earnings from criminal activities exceeded what his father earned through industrial labor, while the work itself was considerably more interesting and less physically demanding than factory employment that destroyed health while providing barely adequate compensation. The family relationships that connected juvenile criminals to legitimate society were systematically undermined through criminal activities that created conflicts between gang loyalty and family obligations, forcing children to choose between criminal associates who provided immediate benefits and family members who represented connections to moral values that interfered with criminal success. Johnny's parents gradually recognized that their son had been lost to forces beyond their control, while understanding that attempts to reclaim him might result in retaliation against family members who lacked the protection that criminal organizations could provide. The transformation of Birmingham's children into criminal soldiers represented more than individual moral corruption, but reflected the systematic failure of legitimate society to provide alternatives to criminal careers for working-class youth, whose families lacked the resources necessary to purchase education, employment opportunities, or social advancement through legal means. The gangs offered what legitimate society had denied: purpose, income, respect, and the possibility of advancement based on merit rather than family connections or inherited wealth. The children who survived their criminal apprenticeships would become the next generation of gang leaders, carrying forward traditions of violence and criminal enterprise while adapting those traditions to meet changing social and economic conditions that would continue to favor criminal organizations over legitimate institutions in Birmingham's working-class districts. Johnny Fletcher's education in Birmingham's streets was preparing him not just for criminal career success, but for leadership roles in organizations that would continue to challenge governmental authority and exploit social conditions that created opportunities for illegal profit through methods that exceeded anything his society had previously witnessed or imagined. Chapter 11. The Newspaper Wars. The dawn edition of the Birmingham Post lay scattered across Watery Lane in blood-stained sheets that told the story of a circulation war fought not with competing headlines, but with razors, clubs, and the absolute determination of criminal organisations that understood information control meant profit control, in a city where illegal betting generated more revenue than most legitimate businesses. Billy Hill stood over the broken body of newsagent Thomas Whitfield, whose crime had been selling papers that supported rival gang interests while refusing to distribute publications that promoted Billy Kimber's racing tips and betting odds to customers who trusted printed information more than street corner whispers. The newspaper wars that consumed Birmingham during the summer of 1925 represented a sophisticated understanding of information warfare that demonstrated how far criminal organisations had evolved beyond simple street thuggery to embrace methods that would have impressed military strategists and political operatives. Control of news distribution meant control of betting information, race results, and the subtle propaganda that shaped public opinion about which criminal organisations deserved respect and which merited contempt from residents who depended on gang protection for their daily survival. Hill's operation had been planned with the thoroughness that characterised successful criminal enterprises in Birmingham's competitive underworld, where failure to anticipate police response or rival gang retaliation could result in lengthy prison sentences or violent death for participants who lacked the intelligence necessary to survive in careers that demanded both physical courage and strategic thinking. The assault on Whitfield's newsstand was designed to send a message that would be understood throughout Birmingham's network of news vendors, shop owners, and street corner entrepreneurs who earned their living by selling information to customers whose decisions were influenced by what they read in newspapers that reflected criminal rather than editorial interests. Whitfield's beating had been conducted in full view of morning commuters who were travelling to factory jobs that would occupy their attention for the next 12 hours, ensuring that news of the assault would spread throughout Birmingham's working-class districts with the efficiency that only violence could generate. The message was simple and unambiguous. Newsagents who supported rival gangs would face consequences that made cooperation with Hill's organisation seem like a wise business decision, while those who demonstrated loyalty to approved publications would receive protection that government authorities could not provide. The control of information distribution in Birmingham's criminal underworld was more complex than simple censorship, involving subtle manipulation of news content, selective emphasis of stories that supported particular criminal interests, and coordination between newspaper publishers and gang leaders who understood that public opinion could be shaped through careful management of information that readers accepted as objective reporting of factual events. Racing newspapers were particularly valuable to criminal organisations because they provided the betting information that determined how thousands of pounds would be wagered on horses throughout Birmingham's illegal gambling establishments. Publishers who received financial support from gang leaders would emphasise information that encouraged betting on horses whose odds had been manipulated through criminal intervention, while downplaying news about competitors whose victories would result in significant losses for criminal organisations that had invested heavily in predetermined outcomes. The relationship between Birmingham's newspaper publishers and criminal organisations was both profitable and dangerous, involving financial arrangements that could enhance legitimate business profits while creating dependencies that made publishers vulnerable to demands that exceeded simple news manipulation. Editors who accepted criminal financing discovered that their editorial independence had been compromised permanently, while publishers who attempted to maintain journalistic integrity found themselves excluded from information sources that were essential for competitive news coverage. James Morrison, editor of the Birmingham Racing News, had established his publication's success through relationships with criminal organisations that provided exclusive access to information about race fixing, betting manipulation, and the various schemes that determined winners and losers in England's supposedly legitimate sporting events. His readers trusted his recommendations because they understood that Morrison's sources possessed insider knowledge that exceeded anything available through official channels, while remaining unaware that the information they received had been carefully selected to serve criminal rather than reader interests. The competition between different criminal organisations for control of Birmingham's information networks created opportunities for newspaper publishers who were willing to play multiple sides against each other while avoiding commitments that might prove fatal when gang warfare inevitably erupted into open violence. Publishers who maintained flexibility could profit from relationships with competing criminal organizations while preserving enough independence to survive changes in gang leadership that periodically reshuffled Birmingham's criminal hierarchy through methods that were brutal but effective. Morrison's assassination was conducted during the Tuesday morning editorial meeting, where the racing news staff gathered to plan coverage of the week's sporting events, ensuring that his death would serve as education for journalists throughout Birmingham who might be tempted to challenge criminal control of information distribution. The killer was Danny McCann, whose speciality was eliminating targets in public locations where witnesses would enhance rather than diminish the psychological impact of carefully planned violence. McCann entered the newspaper's offices through the front door during normal business hours, his appearance unremarkable enough to avoid attracting attention from employees who were accustomed to visits from various sources who provided information for publication in exchange for small payments or favorable coverage of their activities. His weapon was a knife designed specifically for assassination work, with a blade long enough to reach vital organs, but narrow enough to minimize external bleeding that might interfere with his escape before Morrison's death was discovered by associates. The murder itself was swift and professional, conducted with methods that demonstrated McCann's experience in eliminating targets who posed threats to criminal organizations that valued discretion more than dramatic displays of violence. Morrison died without understanding why his editorial decisions had warranted execution, while his staff learned that journalism in Birmingham involved risks that exceeded anything taught in schools that prepared reporters for careers in legitimate publications serving law-abiding readers. The immediate impact of Morrison's death was felt throughout Birmingham's newspaper industry, as publishers and editors recognized that their survival depended on maintaining relationships with criminal organizations that could provide protection or order elimination, depending on editorial decisions that were now subject to criminal rather than journalistic considerations. The freedom of the press that democratic societies claim to guarantee had been replaced by a system where information distribution served criminal rather than public interests. The consolidation of newspaper control under criminal management was accomplished through a combination of financial incentives and violent threats that made cooperation more attractive than resistance for publishers who understood that their choice was between profitable partnership with gang leaders or potentially fatal independence that could result in business destruction and personal elimination. Most publishers chose survival over principle, creating information networks that served criminal rather than public interests, while maintaining the appearance of legitimate journalism. The distribution networks that carried newspapers throughout Birmingham were controlled by criminal organizations that used their influence over news vendors, shop owners, and street corner salesmen to ensure that approved publications received prominent display, while competing newspapers were relegated to less visible locations or eliminated entirely from areas where gang control was absolute. Customers who requested publications that conflicted with criminal interests were educated about the benefits of reading approved newspapers through methods that were persuasive rather than violent, but left no doubt about the consequences of persistent non-cooperation. The content of Birmingham's newspapers was gradually adapted to serve criminal interests, while maintaining enough legitimate news coverage to preserve reader credibility and avoid attracting unwanted government attention to publications that had become propaganda instruments for criminal organizations. Sports coverage emphasized betting opportunities that would benefit particular gangs, while crime reporting focused on activities of rival organizations, while ignoring or minimizing coverage of criminal activities conducted by gangs that had established relationships with particular publications. The advertising revenue that supported Birmingham's newspapers was increasingly controlled by criminal organizations that owned or influenced legitimate businesses, requiring newspaper advertising to reach customers throughout the city's working-class districts. Businesses that failed to advertise in approved publications discovered that their customers received information about alternative shopping opportunities, while their premises became vulnerable to criminal activities that made continued operation extremely difficult. The employment opportunities available to journalists in Birmingham became limited to positions with publications that served criminal interests, while reporters who attempted to maintain independence found themselves excluded from information sources that were essential for competitive news coverage. The profession of journalism was transformed from public service into criminal enterprise support, with reporters serving as intelligence gatherers and propaganda specialists for organizations that valued information control more than truth dissemination. The success of criminal control over Birmingham's newspaper industry demonstrated that information warfare could be more effective than physical violence for maintaining criminal authority over urban populations that depended on printed news for understanding events that affected their daily lives. The newspaper wars had been won not through superior journalism, but through superior organization and willingness to employ methods that legitimate publishers could not match without abandoning the principles that theoretically distinguished journalism from criminal enterprise. The transformation of Birmingham's press from independent journalism into criminal propaganda represented a fundamental change in the relationship between criminal organizations and the communities they controlled, creating information monopolies that served gang interests, while denying residents access to news coverage that might inspire resistance to criminal authority or cooperation with law enforcement agencies attempting to restore legitimate governmental control over urban populations that had been abandoned to criminal management through default rather than design. Chapter 12. Inside Winson Green. The iron gates of Winson Green Prison clanged shut behind Harry Fowler on a grey November morning in 1924, but the sound brought no fear to a man who understood that Birmingham's most notorious correctional facility was merely another territory to be conquered through the same methods that had made him king of Aston's streets. Within the prison's towering brick walls, Fowler would discover that survival required adapting his criminal skills to an environment where official authority was even more corrupt than Birmingham's police force, while inmate hierarchies were maintained through violence that exceeded anything he had witnessed during years of gang warfare in the city's industrial districts. Winson Green Prison in 1924 housed nearly 800 inmates in conditions that would have horrified social reformers if those reformers had possessed the courage to investigate institutions that government authorities preferred to ignore as long as they remained relatively quiet. The overcrowded cells, inadequate sanitation, and brutal discipline that characterized daily life within the prison's walls created an environment where criminal organizations could flourish by providing services that official institutions either could not or would not offer to inmates whose survival depended on relationships with fellow prisoners rather than cooperation with prison staff. The prison's internal economy was controlled by criminal organizations that had established themselves through methods that combined traditional gang warfare with innovations that reflected the unique opportunities and constraints of institutional confinement. Currency consisted of tobacco, alcohol, and various luxuries that could be smuggled into the prison through networks involving corrupt guards, compromised visitors, and inmates whose outside connections provided access to contraband that commanded premium prices within the prison's artificial scarcity economy. Fowler's reputation as one of Birmingham's most dangerous gang leaders had preceded his arrival at Winson Green, ensuring that established prison gangs viewed him as either a valuable recruit or a dangerous threat that required immediate elimination before he could establish an independent power base within the institution's complex social hierarchy. His first week inside would determine whether he would adapt successfully to prison conditions or join the substantial number of inmates who died violently within months of their arrival at institutions that were theoretically designed to rehabilitate rather than destroy the criminals committed to their custody. The dominant criminal organization within Winson Green was led by Thomas Whitfield, a lifer whose murder conviction had resulted in a death sentence that had been commuted to life imprisonment through political connections that continued to provide him with privileges and protection that ordinary inmates could not access through legitimate channels. Whitfield's organization controlled the prison's most lucrative criminal enterprises while maintaining relationships with corrupt officials who ensured that his activities remained invisible to government inspectors and prison reformers who occasionally visited the institution. Whitfield's crew consisted of approximately 30 inmates whose criminal skills had been developed through careers that spanned multiple decades and various correctional institutions throughout England. Their specialities included violence, intimidation, smuggling, and the complex negotiations necessary for maintaining criminal enterprises within environments where official surveillance theoretically made illegal activities impossible. These men had learned to adapt their criminal skills to institutional constraints while discovering opportunities for profit that were unavailable in legitimate society. The initiation test that Whitfield designed for Fowler was both simple and deadly, requiring the new inmate to eliminate another prisoner whose continued existence threatened the established order that Whitfield's organization had created within the prison's social structure. The target was Jimmy Morrison, a convicted rapist whose crimes had made him unpopular with both inmates and staff, while his known cooperation with prison authorities had marked him for elimination by criminal organizations that viewed informants as existential threats to their continued operation. Morrison's murder was conducted in the prison workshop, where inmates labored at tasks that were designed more for punishment than productivity, creating an environment where industrial accidents could be staged to conceal deliberate killings that served criminal rather than official purposes. Fowler's method was efficient and virtually undetectable, involving the modification of machinery that would crush Morrison's skull, while creating the appearance of accidental death that would not trigger intensive investigation by authorities, who preferred to avoid publicity about conditions within institutions they were responsible for managing. The successful completion of Fowler's initiation test established his position within Winson Green's criminal hierarchy, while demonstrating that his reputation for violence was based on genuine capabilities rather than exaggerated street legends. His acceptance into Whitfield's organization provided him with protection from other inmates, while creating opportunities for advancement within criminal enterprises that generated substantial profits despite the constraints of institutional confinement. The prison's corruption extended from individual guards who could be purchased for modest sums to senior administrators whose cooperation enabled large-scale criminal operations that would have been impossible without official complicity. Governor James Morrison had transformed his institution into a business enterprise where inmates with financial resources could purchase amenities that included private cells, special food, unlimited visitors, and communication privileges that allowed them to continue directing criminal organizations operating throughout Birmingham and beyond. The services available for purchase within Winson Green included medical care that exceeded what was provided through official channels, legal assistance from corrupt lawyers who specialized in prison cases, and protection from violent inmates who posed threats to prisoners whose crimes or cooperation with authorities had made them vulnerable to retaliation from criminal organizations that viewed the prison as an extension of their territorial control rather than a government institution operating according to official regulations. The workshops and educational programs that were supposed to prepare inmates for legitimate careers upon release had been converted into training centers for advanced criminal techniques that were taught by experienced instructors whose knowledge exceeded anything available through conventional education. Inmates learned specialized skills that included safecracking, counterfeiting, advanced lockpicking, and the complex financial manipulations necessary for managing criminal enterprises that generated substantial profits while avoiding detection by law enforcement agencies whose capabilities were limited by legal constraints that did not apply to criminal organizations. The communication networks that connected Winson Green's inmates to criminal organizations operating throughout England were sophisticated and reliable, involving coded messages, corrupt postal workers, and visitor systems that allowed imprisoned gang leaders to maintain control over their territories while serving sentences that were supposed to remove them from positions where they could continue criminal activities. The prison had become a command center for criminal enterprises rather than an institution designed to interrupt criminal careers through punishment and rehabilitation. The violence that maintained order within Winson Green's inmate population was both more systematic and more brutal than anything that occurred in Birmingham's street gang warfare, reflecting the concentration of violent criminals within an environment where escape was impossible and conflict had to be resolved through methods that ensured permanent solutions to disputes that might otherwise continue indefinitely. Murders were conducted with creativity that reflected both the constraints of institutional confinement and the resourcefulness of criminals who had learned to adapt their techniques to available materials and opportunities. The psychological impact of prolonged incarceration on inmates who had spent their careers in environments where violence was commonplace was complex and often counterproductive, creating conditions where rehabilitation became virtually impossible, while criminal skills were refined through exposure to techniques and perspectives that were not available in legitimate society. Fowler discovered that prison was essentially a university for criminal education, where inmates could acquire advanced knowledge while building networks that would enhance their criminal careers upon release. The relationships that developed between inmates during their incarceration often persisted after release, creating criminal partnerships that exceeded anything that could have been achieved through street recruitment processes that were limited by territorial boundaries and organizational loyalties. The prison had become a networking center for criminal enterprises, where inmates from different gangs could establish cooperation agreements that would reshape Birmingham's criminal landscape when they returned to active participation in illegal activities. The official statistics that government authorities used to evaluate Winson Green's performance bore no resemblance to the actual conditions within the institution, where corruption had created an alternative reality that served criminal rather than correctional purposes.
Inmates who possessed financial resources or valuable criminal skills could purchase treatment that exceeded what was available to law-abiding citizens in legitimate society, while prisoners who lacked such assets were subjected to conditions that would have been considered torture if applied to enemies during wartime. The rehabilitation programs that were supposed to prepare inmates for legitimate careers upon release had been abandoned in favor of criminal education that prepared prisoners for more successful illegal careers, while building organizational relationships that would make them more dangerous to society than they had been before their incarceration. The prison had become a finishing school for criminal careers, rather than an institution designed to protect society from dangerous individuals who posed threats to public safety and social order. Fowler's adaptation to prison life was successful beyond his expectations, as he discovered that institutional confinement provided opportunities for criminal advancement that exceeded what was available through street gang activities in Birmingham's competitive underworld. His position within Winson Green's criminal hierarchy would provide him with connections, knowledge, and organizational skills that would make him a more formidable gang leader when he eventually returned to active participation in Birmingham's criminal enterprises. Chapter 13. The Reckoning Comes. The first light of dawn on September 15, 1927, brought with it the sound of boots on cobblestones, as Detective Chief Inspector Reginald Spooner led a coordinated assault on gang strongholds throughout Birmingham, his newfound commitment to law enforcement fueled by political pressure from London and personal revenge against criminal organizations that had betrayed his trust once too often. The man who had spent years taking bribes from Billy Kimber's organization now carried warrants that would either destroy Birmingham's criminal empire or result in his own violent death at the hands of men who possessed detailed knowledge of his corrupt activities and little reason to show mercy to a former ally who had become their most dangerous enemy. Spooner's transformation from corrupt detective to zealous law enforcement officer had been precipitated by the murder of his younger brother, Constable William Spooner, whose honest police work had threatened criminal operations that Reginald had been paid to protect. The killing had been conducted by Danny Sullivan's crew, as a warning to law enforcement officials who refused to accept the financial arrangements that had made Birmingham's police force complicit in criminal activities throughout the city's industrial districts. The murder had been both personal and professional, designed to eliminate a threat while demonstrating that criminal organizations possessed the power to strike at their enemies, regardless of official position or police protection. The evidence that Spooner had assembled during months of careful investigation represented the accumulated intelligence of a man who possessed intimate knowledge of criminal operations, combined with the determination of someone seeking revenge for personal wrongs that exceeded professional considerations. His files contained details about gang finances, territorial boundaries, corrupt officials, and the complex relationships that connected Birmingham's criminal organizations to similar enterprises throughout England and continental Europe. The dawn raids that Spooner had planned were designed to decapitate Birmingham's criminal organizations through simultaneous arrests of key leaders, while seizing financial records and weapons that would provide evidence for prosecutions that could result in lengthy prison sentences or executions that would permanently eliminate threats to legitimate governmental authority. The operation involved nearly 200 police officers who had been recruited from neighbouring jurisdictions to avoid intelligence leaks that had compromised previous law enforcement efforts against organised crime. The first target was Billy Kimber's headquarters in the Garrison Tavern, where the gang leader was believed to be planning retaliatory strikes against rival organisations that had challenged his authority during recent territorial disputes. The assault was led by Inspector Morrison, a Scotland Yard detective whose reputation for incorruptible service had made him immune to the financial inducements that had compromised most of Birmingham's local police force. His men were armed with weapons that exceeded anything available to criminal organisations, while their tactics had been developed through consultation with military experts who understood urban warfare techniques. The battle for the Garrison Tavern lasted nearly 2 hours, as Kimber's men fought with the desperate fury of criminals who understood that capture would result in trials that could lead to death sentences for individuals whose criminal careers had included multiple murders. The gang members had prepared their stronghold for siege conditions, stockpiling weapons and ammunition, while creating defensive positions that would allow them to resist law enforcement assault for extended periods, while hoping that political pressure would force withdrawal of attacking officers. Kimber himself was found in the pub's basement, surrounded by financial records that detailed the scope of his criminal empire, while documenting the corruption that had enabled his organisation to operate with virtual impunity for nearly a decade. His capture represented more than simple arrest, but marked the beginning of legal proceedings that would expose the systematic breakdown of law enforcement that had allowed criminal organisations to challenge governmental authority throughout Birmingham's working-class districts. The evidence seized during the raid included detailed accounts of protection payments made to police officers, magistrates, and city officials whose cooperation had enabled criminal activities that generated hundreds of thousands of pounds in illegal profits, while victimising residents who lacked the resources necessary to purchase protection from predators who should have been controlled by legitimate authorities. The documentation revealed corruption that extended far beyond individual misconduct to include systematic arrangements that had transformed law enforcement from public service into criminal enterprise support. The second phase of Spooner's operation targeted the Sabini gang's Birmingham operations, focusing on racing establishments where illegal gambling generated substantial revenues, while providing cover for various other criminal activities that included money laundering, stolen goods trafficking, and the coordination of criminal enterprises operating throughout England's industrial regions. The assault was complicated by the presence of legitimate racing officials and wealthy patrons, whose connections to government authorities made arrests politically sensitive, while their potential testimony could provide crucial evidence for prosecution of criminal activities. Charles Sabini's capture required careful coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies, as his organisation possessed intelligence networks that provided advance warning of police activities, while maintaining safe houses and escape routes that had been established throughout the Midlands. His arrest was accomplished through deception that involved corrupt associates who had been turned by Spooner's investigators, creating intelligence opportunities that allowed law enforcement officers to anticipate and counter criminal countermeasures. The trials that followed these arrests would expose the full extent of corruption that had enabled Birmingham's criminal organisations to operate with governmental complicity, while demonstrating that criminal enterprises had evolved beyond simple street gangs to become alternative governmental structures that provided services and maintained order in neighbourhoods that legitimate authorities had abandoned to criminal control. The legal proceedings would reveal systematic failures that extended throughout England's urban areas, where similar conditions had created opportunities for organised crime that exceeded anything previously seen in British history. The testimony provided by criminal defendants seeking reduced sentences revealed the sophisticated nature of Birmingham's criminal enterprises, including their connections to similar organisations throughout Europe, and their involvement in activities that included international smuggling, currency manipulation, and political corruption that extended into Parliament itself. The scope of criminal activity that was exposed during these trials shocked government officials, who had assumed that organised crime represented isolated local problems rather than systematic challenges to legitimate governmental authority. The public reaction to revelations about police corruption and criminal control of urban neighbourhoods created political pressure for reforms that would strengthen law enforcement capabilities while addressing social conditions that had made criminal careers attractive alternatives to legitimate employment for working-class youth, who lacked access to educational and economic opportunities that were available to more privileged segments of society. The sentences imposed on convicted gang leaders were designed to serve as deterrents to other criminal organisations, while permanently removing dangerous individuals from communities where their continued presence would threaten public safety and social order. Billy Kimber received a death sentence that was later commuted to life imprisonment, while other gang leaders faced lengthy prison terms that would effectively end their criminal careers, while providing opportunities for rehabilitation that previous sentences had failed to achieve. The impact of these prosecutions on Birmingham's criminal landscape was immediate and dramatic, as remaining gang members fled the city or abandoned criminal activities in favour of legitimate employment that had previously seemed inadequate compared to illegal alternatives that offered better pay and more interesting work. The systematic destruction of criminal organisations created opportunities for legitimate businesses and governmental authorities to reassert control over neighbourhoods that had been ruled by criminal enterprises for nearly a decade. The success of Spooner's campaign against organised crime demonstrated that effective law enforcement required not only honest police officers, but also political support, adequate resources, and coordination between multiple agencies that could match the organisational capabilities that criminal enterprises had developed through years of successful operation. The reckoning that had finally come to Birmingham's gang leaders proved that criminal empires could be destroyed when legitimate authorities possessed the determination and resources necessary to challenge organisations that had grown powerful through governmental neglect and official corruption. The lessons learned through Birmingham's experience with organised crime would influence law enforcement policies throughout England, while serving as warnings about the consequences of allowing criminal organisations to establish territorial control in urban areas where legitimate governmental authority had been weakened through corruption, inadequate resources, or political indifference to conditions affecting working-class populations who lacked political influence necessary to demand effective protection from criminal predation. Chapter 14. The Last of the Blinders. The winter wind howled through the broken windows of the abandoned Garrison Tavern as Tommy Morrison, the last surviving member of Thomas Gilbert's original crew, sat alone among the ruins of what had once been Birmingham's most feared criminal enterprise. The pub that had served as headquarters for gang operations throughout Smallheath now stood empty and decaying, its blood-stained floors bearing witness to violence that had claimed the lives of every man who had once called this place home. Morrison's presence in these ruins was not nostalgia, but necessity, as the manhunt that had destroyed Birmingham's criminal organisations continued to claim victims who had believed themselves safely hidden from law enforcement attention that had finally learned to be both thorough and ruthless. The systematic destruction of Birmingham's gang structure during the previous 2 years had exceeded anything that police reformers had believed possible, demonstrating that criminal organisations which had seemed invincible could be eliminated when legitimate authorities possessed adequate resources and political support for sustained law enforcement campaigns. The raids, arrests, trials and executions that had followed Detective Chief Inspector Spooner's decision to wage war against his former criminal associates had left the city's underworld in ruins, with surviving gang members scattered throughout England or dead in unmarked graves that would never be discovered by investigators seeking to compile complete records of the casualties inflicted during Birmingham's criminal wars. Morrison's survival was due more to luck than skill, as his absence from Birmingham during the crucial period when police raids were decimating gang leadership had allowed him to escape the net that had captured or killed most of his criminal associates. His return to the city had revealed a transformed landscape where former gang territories were patrolled by honest police officers, where protection rackets had been replaced by legitimate business operations, and where the fear that had once made criminal organisations invincible had been transferred to the remaining criminals, who now lived as hunted fugitives in neighbourhoods that had once provided sanctuary. The Garrison Tavern's destruction was both literal and symbolic, representing the end of an era when criminal organisations had possessed the power to challenge governmental authority, while providing services that legitimate institutions had failed to offer to working-class populations who had been abandoned by social structures that served wealth rather than need. The building's current condition reflected the broader collapse of Birmingham's criminal empire, where strongholds that had once seemed impregnable had been reduced to ruins by forces that combined legal authority with popular support from residents who had grown tired of living under criminal rule. Morrison's presence in the ruins was motivated by more than sentimental attachment to locations where he had spent his criminal career, but by practical necessity as he searched for hidden assets that might provide resources for escape from England before law enforcement agencies completed their systematic elimination of Birmingham's criminal survivors. The gang leaders who had accumulated substantial wealth through years of illegal activities had cached money, weapons and valuable merchandise in locations throughout the city, creating treasure troves that could fund new criminal enterprises if they could be recovered by individuals who possessed knowledge of their locations. The search through the garrison's ruins revealed evidence of violence that had characterized the pub's final days, when Gilbert's crew had made their last stand against police forces that possessed superior numbers, better weapons, and political authority that made their victory inevitable, regardless of criminal resistance. Bloodstains on walls and floors told stories of individual confrontations where desperate men had fought with weapons and tactics that were inadequate against opponents who combined professional training with moral authority that criminal organizations could not match through superior violence alone. The hidden cache that Morrison finally located beneath the pub's collapsed cellar floor contained enough money to fund passage to America, where criminal opportunities might still exist for individuals whose skills had been developed through survival in Birmingham's competitive underworld. The currency was mixed British pounds and foreign notes that reflected the international scope of Gilbert's criminal operations, while forged documents provided identities that could allow escape from legal jurisdiction that extended throughout the British Empire, but did not necessarily reach into countries where different legal systems might prove more tolerant of criminal refugees. The city that Morrison observed during his nocturnal movement through Birmingham's transformed neighbourhoods bore little resemblance to the territory he had once known as intimately as a farmer knows his fields. Streets that had been controlled by criminal organisations were now patrolled by police officers whose honest service had restored governmental authority, while businesses that had paid protection money to gang leaders now operated under legal protection that was both more reliable and more affordable than criminal alternatives that had offered temporary security in exchange for permanent subjugation. The residents whose lives had been shaped by criminal rule were adapting to legitimate governmental authority with enthusiasm that surprised social observers who had assumed that working-class populations preferred criminal organizations that provided immediate services over legal institutions that operated according to constitutional principles. The restoration of honest law enforcement had revealed that most residents had cooperated with criminal organizations from necessity rather than preference, understanding that resistance to gang rule would result in violence that legitimate authorities had been unable to prevent. The children who had been recruited into criminal careers were being redirected toward legitimate opportunities through educational and employment programs that offered alternatives to illegal activities that had previously seemed like the only available paths to economic advancement for working-class youth whose families lacked resources necessary for social mobility through conventional channels. The systematic destruction of criminal recruitment networks had broken cycles of criminal inheritance that had perpetuated gang membership across multiple generations of families whose survival had depended on illegal activities. Morrison's final night in Birmingham was spent in the cemetery where many of his former associates had been buried, after meeting violent deaths that had been inevitable consequences of criminal careers that offered immediate rewards in exchange for shortened lifespans and constant danger. The graves of Billy Kimber, Danny Sullivan, Mickey O'Brien, and dozens of other gang members served as reminders that criminal success was temporary, while criminal consequences were permanent, creating legacies that consisted primarily of violence, corruption, and social damage that would require years to repair. The transformation of Birmingham from criminal territory to legitimate governmental control represented more than simple law enforcement success, but demonstrated that organized crime could be eliminated when social conditions that had created opportunities for criminal careers were addressed through comprehensive reforms that included economic development, educational expansion, and political changes that made governmental institutions responsive to working-class needs that had previously been ignored by authorities who served wealth rather than population. The morning train that carried Morrison toward Liverpool and eventual passage to America also carried his memories of Birmingham's criminal era, experiences that would influence his future activities, while serving as historical testimony to conditions that had made England's industrial cities fertile ground for criminal organizations that challenged governmental authority, while exploiting social problems that legitimate institutions had failed to address effectively. The empty buildings that had once housed Birmingham's criminal enterprises would be demolished or converted to legitimate purposes, erasing physical evidence of gang rule, while creating opportunities for economic development that served community needs rather than criminal profits. The Garrison Tavern would eventually be replaced by a community centre that provided educational and recreational services for residents who had once lived under criminal control, transforming locations that had symbolised criminal power into symbols of legitimate community development. The last of the Peaky Blinders was disappearing into history, not through heroic sacrifice or dramatic confrontation, but through the quiet defeat of criminal organisations that had proven incapable of adapting to social changes that made their services unnecessary, while making their methods unacceptable to populations that had discovered alternatives to criminal rule. Morrison's escape to America would mark the end of Birmingham's gang era, while his memories would serve as the only remaining testimony to criminal empires that had briefly challenged governmental authority, before being destroyed by forces that combined legal power with popular support. The legacy of Birmingham's criminal organisations would persist in various forms, including law enforcement techniques that had been developed to combat organised crime, social policies that addressed conditions which had made criminal careers attractive, and historical memories that would influence popular understanding of relationships between criminal organisations and legitimate governmental authority. The real Peaky Blinders had been neither romantic anti-heroes nor noble rebels, but desperate criminals, whose activities had reflected social conditions that legitimate institutions had failed to address until criminal alternatives became unacceptable to populations that demanded better solutions to problems that required governmental rather than criminal responses. Chapter 15. Legacy of Blood. The Birmingham of 1932 bore scars that would never fully heal, invisible wounds carved into the collective memory of a city that had witnessed the rise and fall of criminal empires built on blood, brutality, and the exploitation of working-class desperation. Where the Garrison Tavern had once stood, a children's playground occupied ground that had been soaked with the blood of men who died for territory measured in city blocks, while the laughter of young voices provided haunting counterpoint to memories of violence that had shaped an entire generation's understanding of power, loyalty, and the price of survival in England's industrial heartland. Thomas Gilbert lay buried in an unmarked grave in Key Hill Cemetery, his final resting place known only to the gravedigger who had been paid extra to ensure that no monument would mark the spot where Birmingham's most notorious gang leader had found the peace that had eluded him during a life dedicated to violence. The razor blades that had once gleamed in his flat cap had been confiscated as evidence during his final arrest, eventually finding their way into a police museum where they served as educational artifacts for officers who needed to understand the weapons and methods employed by criminal organisations that might resurface if social conditions ever again created opportunities for organised crime to flourish. The residents of Small Heath, Bawdsley and Aston, who had survived Birmingham's criminal era, carried memories that shaped their responses to authority, conflict, and community relationships for the remainder of their lives. Children who had witnessed gang warfare understood violence in ways that their peers in more peaceful neighbourhoods could never comprehend, while adults who had paid protection money to criminal organisations retained scepticism about governmental promises that was rooted in experiences with authorities who had proven unreliable when protection was needed most desperately. The economic transformation that followed the destruction of Birmingham's criminal organisations created opportunities for legitimate business development that had been impossible when gang control made normal commerce subject to criminal taxation and territorial restrictions. Shops that had paid tribute to gang leaders reinvested those savings in expansion and improvement, while new businesses established themselves in areas that had previously been too dangerous for entrepreneurs who lacked criminal protection or connections to gang leadership. The police reforms that had enabled effective law enforcement against organised crime became permanent features of Birmingham's governmental structure, creating institutional safeguards against the corruption that had allowed criminal organisations to operate with virtual impunity for nearly a decade. The salary increases, professional training, and oversight mechanisms that had been implemented to combat gang influence were maintained to prevent the return of conditions that had made police officers vulnerable to criminal recruitment and cooperation. The social programs that addressed underlying conditions which had made criminal careers attractive alternatives to legitimate employment represented lasting changes in governmental attitudes toward working-class populations whose needs had previously been ignored by authorities who served wealth rather than population. Educational opportunities, job training programs, and community development initiatives that had been created to compete with criminal recruitment efforts continued to provide alternatives to illegal activities for young people whose families lacked resources necessary for conventional social advancement.
The children who had been recruited into criminal organizations but rescued before their moral development was permanently damaged grew into adults whose understanding of right and wrong had been shaped by direct experience with consequences of criminal choices. Their testimony in schools, churches, and community organizations provided education about gang life that exceeded anything available through theoretical discussions of crime and punishment, while their successful rehabilitation demonstrated that criminal careers were not inevitable for individuals whose circumstances had made illegal activities seem like rational choices. The women who had participated in Birmingham's criminal enterprises faced particular challenges in rebuilding their lives after the destruction of organizations that had provided economic opportunities unavailable through legitimate employment for working-class females whose options were limited by social structures that restricted female participation in most forms of economic activity. Some succeeded in establishing legitimate businesses using skills developed through criminal careers, while others struggled with poverty that made their previous illegal activities seem attractive, despite the dangers that criminal lifestyles entailed. The corrupt officials whose cooperation had enabled criminal organizations to operate with governmental complicity faced legal consequences that included prison sentences, financial penalties, and professional disgrace that served as warnings to future public servants who might be tempted to accept criminal payments in exchange for compromising their official duties. The exposure of systematic corruption had created political pressure for reforms that strengthened oversight mechanisms while increasing penalties for official misconduct. The international connections that had linked Birmingham's criminal organizations to similar enterprises throughout Europe were severed through law enforcement cooperation that demonstrated the necessity of coordinated responses to criminal activities that transcended national boundaries. The intelligence networks that had been developed to combat organized crime became permanent features of international law enforcement, creating capabilities that would prove essential for addressing future criminal threats that operated on global scales. The cultural impact of Birmingham's gang era would persist in various forms, including literature, folklore, and popular entertainment that romanticized criminal activities while minimizing the human costs of violence that had shaped the lives of thousands of residents who had experienced gang rule as victims rather than participants. The transformation of brutal criminals into romantic anti-heroes reflected society's tendency to mythologize violence while ignoring the suffering that criminal activities inflicted on innocent populations who lacked power to resist criminal exploitation. The real legacy of Birmingham's Peaky Blinders was measured not in romantic legends or entertainment narratives, but in broken families, traumatized communities, and social damage that required generations to repair. The men who had sewn razor blades into their flat caps had not been noble rebels fighting against social injustice, but predators who exploited the desperation of working-class populations while serving their own interests through methods that destroyed everything they touched. The governmental failures that had created opportunities for criminal organizations to establish territorial control in Birmingham's working-class districts provided lessons about the importance of responsive democratic institutions that address social problems before they create conditions favorable to criminal alternatives. The systematic neglect of working-class needs that had made gang membership attractive to young men seeking economic advancement and social respect had been remedied only after criminal organizations had demonstrated the consequences of governmental indifference to urban poverty and social inequality. The violence that had characterized Birmingham's gang warfare served as education about the inevitable consequences of allowing criminal organizations to establish territorial control in urban areas, where legitimate governmental authority had been weakened through corruption, inadequate resources, or political indifference to conditions affecting populations that lacked political influence necessary to demand effective protection from criminal predation. The survivors of Birmingham's criminal era, who lived to see the city's transformation, understood that the destruction of gang rule had been achieved
not through the heroic actions of individual law enforcement officers, but through comprehensive social changes that addressed underlying conditions which had made criminal careers attractive alternatives to legitimate employment for working-class youth, whose families lacked resources necessary for conventional social advancement. The empty lots where gang strongholds had once stood were gradually developed into housing, schools, and community facilities that served legitimate social needs, while erasing physical evidence of criminal rule that had briefly challenged governmental authority, before being destroyed by forces that combined legal power with popular support from residents who had grown tired of living under criminal control. The true legacy of Birmingham's Peaky Blinders was written not in the romantic narratives that would later emerge from popular entertainment, but in the police reports, court records, and cemetery registers that documented the human cost of criminal enterprises that had flourished when legitimate institutions failed to serve populations whose needs had been ignored until criminal alternatives became unacceptable to society that demanded better solutions to problems that required governmental rather than criminal responses. The blood that had soaked into Birmingham's cobblestones during the gang wars of the 1920s had dried and been washed away by countless rains, but the lessons learned through that violence remained embedded in the city's institutional memory, serving as warnings about the consequences of allowing social conditions to deteriorate to levels where criminal organizations could present themselves as preferable alternatives to legitimate governmental authority that had failed to protect the populations it was designed to serve.